History Things podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit holes of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the History Things podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or online at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Pat and Parker are coming right up. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the History Things podcast, rolling along well into season 7 at this point, making some history here on the podcast for the very first time. In 7 years, not once have I flown this crazy-ass ship solo, but guess what? Tonight, that's what's happening. Co-host Parker Russell, the ambassador for Maine, is under the weather in such a way that he cannot sit here and cough next to us. He has to lay down and basically be dying in his house. So we wish him the best. We miss him. We'll catch up with him in our next episode. But I'm not solo in this studio. I'm not here talking to myself like it feels like sometimes. But no, I'm here talking to one of my good friends, a colleague of mine in the historical interpretation community. He is the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Seminary Ridge Museum, and he is a two-time guest on the show, plus he was the gracious host of this very podcast at the 24 Hours on the Ridge Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show, Codie Eash. Welcome back.
Doing well, thank you, Pat. Sorry to hear Parker's under the weather, but happy to make history with.
Dude, when you live in Maine, which he doesn't anymore, but I guess he did for a long time, you just kind of live in this. The winter is so cold. I stay having a cold. I don't know. He just called me this morning. Was like, I can't make it. And I was like, damn right you can't with that voice. We are a podcast. Our listeners would hate that. It's been a long time since I've seen you. I know that was a year ago, 2024, when we did 24 Hours on the Ridge, and I had so much fun, so I know it's been a long time, but thank you again for that opportunity. We really thoroughly enjoyed that. We'll touch on the museum in a moment, but Codie Eash, you're my friend. How you been, man? What the hell's going on with you? What are you working on? How's life?
Been busy. Life's been busy. Good things happening at Seminary Ridge, and then continuing my education and master's program through Gettysburg College and
nice.
Gilder Lehrman, so just finished course 6, have 3 classes to go, and then thesis, which will kind of tie into the topic that we're going to.
Is the thesis? I was going to say, is the thesis top secret or like great? It ties into tonight's conversation.
It'll tie right in. Yep. I'll kind of.
It's not a dissertation, so you don't have to defend it, right? Like you don't have to stand up there and like just take absolute abuse over your work.
That's right. Yep. Just it's a scaffolded assignment throughout the course of the semester. Add to it, right? I think it's a 75-page paper, and I'm already well into research. It's something I've been thinking about for years, looking for a good outlet, and I thought, you know what, this is a good place for it.
As somebody I admire tremendously, respect immensely, and somebody who I acknowledge is a huge nerd in the most positive ways, how easy is it to write 75 pages on something you're interested in?
So the only time I've ever written anything close to that was the other topic that we talked about. I think the first time I was on was Alexander Hughes.
Yes.
And that was like a 57 pages maybe. I won't say it was easy, but once you get flowing after you've accumulated all this research, I think I did that in the course of a couple months. Probably was a good practice run. Now that was like 6 years ago or so. A good practice run for what I'll eventually have to do for this. But each semester, whenever we do our 15-page final paper, and Rich Condon, I'll give him a shout out. He and I are basically on the same path together. He's a little bit ahead of me, but I find it, I don't want to say easy, but fluid to go through 15 pages. And you think for some of these, you're like, I don't know if I can fill 15 pages with this topic. And then all of a sudden you're on page 12 and you have 12 more pages of
right. You're like, I have
content.
More to talk about. Yeah,
exactly. So you got to whittle it down. So I'm probably going to regret this a month into that last semester when it eventually comes. But I'm really, really looking forward to the good challenge of writing a 75-page paper and thinking about what I could do beyond that with it. Perhaps.
Are we going to be able to read said 75-page paper at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, and then some. So
we want to get in the mind of Codie Eash.
Yes, yep. And by extension, in this case, it'll be in the mind of Abraham Lincoln in a way that surprisingly nobody has ever really focused on.
Oh, see, that's what we like. So this is entertainment after all, even though it's educational. So we like exclusivities, things like that. So Codie Eash, exclusive look into Lincoln's mind coming up. So before we get into that, Codie, we have some announcements from the museum.
Yes.
Breaking news with Codie Eash.
So when you guys recorded that awesome episode, which every once and again we'll still get somebody who has listened to it or who was there.
That feels good. Thank you very much.
So that was a really fun night. Since that point in time, we've had some awesome changes to Seminary Ridge. It was a big year of change throughout 2025. This was we celebrated our 12th year since opening this past July. And we did a big AV overhaul. So if you haven't been to the museum in at least a year, there's brand new screens.
Oh, that's
brand
awesome.
New audio. And then we did a big artifact rotation, our biggest possibly ever, but at least since the first couple of years the museum was open. 108 new artifacts.
Whoa.
Including pieces on each exhibit floor. A lot of stuff that was found in and around the seminary building during the most recent archaeological dig in 2011, 2012, before we opened in 2013. Bunch of stuff related to the battle, of course, but then also just to domestic life at the Lutheran Seminary, and allows us, even better ways to dig into that story. Some stuff related to causation of the Civil War, the seminary's founder, Samuel Schmucker, anti-slavery advocate. We always knew that there was writing in his Bible by a Confederate soldier, but we ended up sort of uncovering several other books and pamphlets that were in his library that are identified on July 4th, 1863 by a Confederate surgeon, among others.
What are they writing in the books for? They're just like wounded in the seminary, and they're like, I'm writing this dude's house. I'm just going to write in his Bible.
They ransack it July
Got you on day
1st.
one.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. They ransack it July 1st. Schmucker isn't there. And then on July 4th is when a few of these are dated. I think it's just guys who are waiting to retreat. They're on Seminary Ridge, and they're reading these pamphlets, these religious pamphlets. Schmucker, anti-slavery advocate, no friend to Confederate forces, and some of them are a little vindictive.
I'm saying, are they talking smack about that? Yeah.
There's one guy though randomly who says that, this is the finest piece of theology I've ever read. So it was interesting. There was one that's written C.S. Surgeon, it says on it, but we can't figure out which surgeon definitively. I can't say much yet, but we're going to have some changes to a couple of our exhibit panels, including that we can say with fair amount of certainty we have solved a long-time mystery of the identity of the Confederate soldier who wrote Anne Samuel Schmucker's Bible, which we had the name, what we thought was the name, for a very long time, and I was able to do a little digging. I don't want to say anything yet till I definitively, but I've started looking at some pension records.
So it looked like it's somebody else than who you thought it was?
Sort of. So we didn't really have a definitive person. We couldn't match the name to anybody who appeared in any muster roll, but I was looking through some pension records online and ended up finding the guy. And
that's awesome, man. That's so cool.
Yep. So and then we have among those artifacts as well on loan from several individuals. The coolest piece, I would say, the most significant piece, so much so that it's the first time we've ever added an entire new case since we opened. It was a pair of glasses that were worn by Abraham Lincoln. On loan from a collector in Buffalo, New York, named Ethan F. Shawnee, and he loaned us several pieces, but he came to us first with this pair of glasses that were worn by Lincoln probably midpoint or so of his presidency, based on the prescription strength.
I was going to ask, can you date them to a specific time he's wearing them?
Yes, we don't exactly know when he got them, but he doesn't start wearing glasses until well into his adult life, and there are half a dozen or so confirmed pairs that we know were his, including the pair with him at Ford's Theater. These are the second strongest prescription strength of any of his glasses, and so very well could have been the glasses that he maybe has with him at Gettysburg or thereabouts. If it's sometime during the presidency,
that'd be cool.
He probably has them with him for at least one major event.
See, that's the thing that I like, and I think a lot of people like, is like the tangible, like this was here. Yep. Or, this was this person's type of thing. We have a whole episode that's going to come out, I hope, this year. It's a huge topic. And one, we'll talk about off the mics here, because if by the time we're recording this, we're still in production, even though you're hearing this. You guys know how this show works for post-production, baby. You're seeing this way after it's been recorded. But there's a whole conversation surrounding nostalgia and the role it plays in just our lives and what we do as far as history, people's interests, things like that. But it's a huge concept. I can't wait to share it with you. But that kind of all ties to that with the artifacts, and it was here. So that's awesome. Anything else going on with the museum? Because we got a big one today.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Come check us out if you haven't been in a while.
Social medias.
Yeah, social media, Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. We're especially active on Facebook and Instagram. We've had an increased presence on our YouTube channel. We've started to put up most of our in-person programming offerings, which have really ramped up throughout the course of this year as well. So, yeah, check us out. Go to seminaryridgemuseum.org. Go to the events tab, see what we have coming up. We had something like 65 or so individual events throughout the course of this year. So we're staying busy. We have some virtual stuff. If you're not from the Gettysburg area, don't get a chance to come out. We have our Zoom history happy hours through the winter months. So we have a lot of exciting stuff happening.
Yeah, it's you're hearing this in March, right? So summer's ahead of you. So start drinking your water. Codie Eash is drinking his water. He's getting ready to see you in the heat of July and August for sure. So that's exciting, man. I hope to make it back to the museum soon myself. Might even bring the kids in tow this time. Awesome. So I apologize for the sound in advance. But today we're here to talk about Abraham Lincoln. I wanted to, with the state of things, just to be frank, with the state of things in the world, in the country, and things like that, I'm tired of this concept of division, and I really remember that when I first became interested in the Civil War, Lincoln's second inaugural address was a huge reason I got into it. I was trying to understand just what he was talking about in the sort of like the concepts of healing. And I was like, what are we healing? And then, so I wanted to talk about that because I thought it might be not only personally just interesting to a great many people, but it might be a good time to kind of revisit the better angels of our nature and things like that. And I couldn't think of anybody better to talk about Abraham Lincoln with than you. One of the first things I learned about you was like Lincoln is your thing. So I want to talk about his second inaugural. We can kind of talk about really anything relation to that, because obviously you can't talk about him having an inauguration without getting elected president, much less running for president in one of the most unconventional times and ways to do it. So let's just kind of hand it over to you. Let you kind of just cook, brother. But let's start with some background. So before we're inaugurated, before we're elected, we're in the middle of a civil war. We're in 1860. When do you want to pick it up? 63, 64? When do you start this story?
I would say 64. Yeah, and remind me if I don't think of it myself. I have I didn't print it out, but I have the second inaugural pulled up here. If we could, at some point, once we get to it, maybe in the story, at least do the most famous piece of it.
You can read the whole thing. I don't care.
I'd be happy to read the whole thing.
Our listeners,
it's not very long. Yeah.
Somewhere between will love it, and I don't care if you don't. I want to hear Codie read the whole thing.
Sure.
So yeah, we can do that. Absolutely. That'd be awesome. So at this point, the floor is yours.
Sure. So where I really like to pick up this story, and it's a classic case of when we talk about any historical event, how far back do you go to gain some context? I would say that looking at the second inaugural and the election itself, heading back to at least the previous spring, I think is a helpful place for us to start. And I'm a little biased because that big project that I was talking about that's going to eventually be thesis and beyond is Lincoln's involvement at the sanitary fairs in 1864, and an important piece of context, I suppose, for that we could take even half a step back is, unlike today, where throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries, we think about presidents being relatively omnipresent, where they are going and making speeches, both prepared remarks and unprepared remarks, in front of audiences, whether it's at the White House, whether it's elsewhere in Washington, D.C., traveling around the country. That doesn't exist in the 19th century and the way that we think of today.
Well, digital media especially is a huge part of why we experience it. I mean, that was in a different way. I stumbled over names. The Kennedy-Nixon debates really changed this world in a huge way. But so yeah, we don't have the digital media, so they're not like in your face all the time. Like, yo, what's up? I'm Senator Blah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in that, one of the things that really gets overlooked is that we can count probably on two hands. I didn't do the exact count here, but I would say it's probably less than 10 times throughout the course of the entirety of his 4-year presidency where we see Abraham Lincoln delivering a prepared speech outside of Washington, D.C. That's just one example. And so there's this span where from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 19th, 1863, the Gettysburg Address, the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery. If you were to kind of ask the average person, when do you think the next time Lincoln gives a speech outside of D.C. is, or even really a prepared speech at all, we would probably think, probably sometime in December. Couldn't have been that long.
I have no clue, and I'm going to guess based on what you're already telling me that we're talking like July of 64.
Close. So we're talking March of 64.
Okay,
the next
so
time
I went a little long.
Yeah, but even that's a caveat. That's the Washington D.C. Sanitary Fair, and then so that's in March. In April he goes to Baltimore and gives a Sanitary Fair speech, and then in June he goes to Philadelphia and gives a Sanitary Fair speech, and that's basically it until. The next one I can think of is the second inaugural. Like it's really kind of amazing when we really think of the lack of these prepared remarks going out in front of an audience. We see a couple of these responses to serenades after key U.S. victories throughout the course of the war, but by and large, between the two most famous and many would argue the best two Lincoln speeches, between the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address. This is a president who is not speaking in that sort of traditional sense with any real regularity, and that's very much a product of its time. It's not like Lincoln is just shirking that duty or something like that,
or he's just so good that he's like, look, I do 4 speeches and win the war, and it's just got to be what it's got to be, baby.
Yep, exactly.
Winner's got to win.
So I guess to kind of dive into the story itself. So let's take it to Gettysburg as just kind of a preamble here. Is once he leaves Gettysburg, we have oftentimes seen that since 1864 as being sort of a renaming of the war effort. It is now coming out of the year of emancipation. This is a war definitively for union and for freedom.
Yep.
And contrary to our common understanding of the Gettysburg Address, it's a speech that is not forgotten immediately after. It's overshadowed for sure by Edward Everett and his 2-hour address, which is far more common for its era than Lincoln's brevity was.
Well, for the people in attendance, Lincoln's speech might have been forgotten because of that 2-hour speech. I know that when you numb my mind, I'm like, oh, what happened earlier today? But like in the greater sense, I see what you're saying. There's no way. The words were too profound to be forgotten.
Sure. But sort of on it's flipping that on its head, the common interpretation is often that it doesn't become famous until well after the fact. But in reality, it's 2 weeks later. The American Anti-Slavery Society is having a meeting in Philadelphia, and there's Senator Henry Wilson from Massachusetts, and he's making allusion to Lincoln's address. Frederick Douglass is using pieces of the Gettysburg Address pretty much immediately.
The Lincoln movie, I think, is touching on this right at the beginning of it when he's having the discussion with the 2 soldiers and they're kind of like quoting his own speech. But that would show you that like this has spread. Like your words from that moment have spread.
Absolutely. And one of the critiques, like you can still find this online, one of the critiques of that movie was people saying like there's no possible way that could have been happening in that moment. They don't know what that speech is yet. But in reality, though, it has taken on, certainly, as everything Lincoln has after his assassination, spoiler alert.
He dies?
He dies.
What?
Tragically.
Is that the look into his mind? That's a terrible joke. That is a terrible joke. Anyway.
But, coming out of the Gettysburg Address, we will see just about 2 weeks later that sort of overshadows from just a legal policy perspective, something that is maybe as significant, if not more. And it's that Lincoln ends 1863 with what we today call the State of the Union. At that point in time is the annual address to Congress. It's delivered by a proxy. It's not delivered by the president himself to Congress. And this happens on the same day, December 8th, 1863, as his proclamation on amnesty and Reconstruction, 2 very important documents that are sort of paving the way for what Lincoln plans to do, because it looks like, though it's sort of in the abstract and it's sort of on the horizon, it looks like the Union war effort is going well enough that they can start to plan for what does a post-war society look like. Now, we know that in real time, that'll take nearly a year and a half from that point to actually come to fruition. But I think that's where we can really start to see that Lincoln is thinking about re-election, not just in the vain
in the political sense,
but in the real, like, what, okay,
a continuity, honestly.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. He's basically seeing it as my term so far has been entirely focused on this war, And it looks like if I have the privilege of being reelected, if the American people give me that opportunity, my second term is probably going to be about peace. It's probably going to be about reconstructing this country. And so I think that we can start to see those wheels, we definitely can start to see those wheels turning in December 1863. Now, I'm not going to go through the entirety of these documents, but basically what they say is there's this line in his address to Congress, his State of the Union, if we use the modern term, where he talks about the new reckoning. And the new reckoning, he says, is that we have, from the start of the year, from the start of 1863, we have an entirely new landscape. We have enslaved people who are now free. We have black men who didn't have any rights. Now they're able to carry a rifle on their shoulder, and they are soldiers in the United States military. And this is entirely different than a year earlier, where even though the Emancipation Proclamation is mere days away from being officially enacted, Lincoln is still kind of throwing in a bone there to the idea of colonization. That's completely out the window now by late 1863. The other thing with the Proclamation on Amnesty and Reconstruction is that he's starting to define who's allowed to come back into the Union, because he has had to worry not only by this point about the loyal North, and he's worrying about the entirety of the political spectrum there, people for and against emancipation, African Americans and whites alike, immigrants. How do we deal with all these things?
Right.
Now he also has to start to consider, all right, so if we do win this war and we do reunite the country, to what degree do we punish people, and to what degree do we let them back into the fold? And oftentimes, going ahead to the second inaugural, we take that line with malice toward none, charity for all. And this is a great piece of rhetoric. It's a great mindset for us all to have as Americans. But in that moment, in late 1863 going into 64, I think more accurately, if we were to really sit Lincoln down and ask him, what are your thoughts on this? I think that it would be something along the lines of malice toward some, charity for most.
Okay.
Because in his proclamation on amnesty and Reconstruction, he lays out for the first time this idea, the 10% rule. Think back to your history courses from high school. 10% rule is Lincoln's idea that if 10% of states that were formally declared themselves part of the Confederacy, 10% of those people take a loyalty oath to the United States, that state is welcomed back into the Union. It can come back with its proper practical relations, as Lincoln calls it. A line I'll probably use a few times because it's a good one.
Yeah.
But with that, Lincoln says, not everybody can take this exact same oath and get off scot-free. He says that I think I have this idea that there are some people who there might be exceptions for. And he specifically lays out anybody who held the rank of colonel or above in the Confederate military, possibly there's an exception for you, up to and including a potential treason trial. Anybody who was in the United States government or the United States military and left that post, elected or otherwise, military or otherwise, if you left that and joined the Confederacy, you're possibly exempt from this. You might be subject to a treason trial.
Because I was going to ask a question, if I can interrupt with that. So those elected officials who resign, abandon, whatever their post, I got to imagine, because there's always, if there's one thing I've learned in doing this show is that if you speak in what is a very obvious and understood generalization, you're still going to get an email from somebody that's like, well, here's this one thing. So I know that it's probably most people that resign their posts, abandon, whatever, join the Confederacy. Are there people that just go, I can't be a part of this, my heart's here, I just won't, and just go home and don't do anything with the Confederacy? Do you know the answer to that question?
I'm sure that there are. It feels like there would be way too many people who that could apply to for it not to happen at all. I can't think of any names offhand, but I'm sure.
But it leads to this question. Based on your understanding of Lincoln's mentality at this time, would that apply to those people? Like the malice towards some? Like, it's like, all right, they left, but like they didn't go and help.
Yeah, probably not. I think that's...
They just kind of went home, right? Like, I'm just wondering, because
sure,
everything has got these like complexities to them and things like that, and I just wonder where that lives in the minutia.
Lincoln there's so much nuance to Lincoln, right, in all respects, and I think it's one of the greatest character qualities that a president has ever exhibited, is that he's able to not only evolve on issues, but he's able to sort of see solutions on both sides of the aisle in most instances. And he has this great line, which we'll come back to in a little while too, because it's the last speech that he gives right after the second inaugural. which is another speech on Reconstruction. It's the last speech he ever gives. And he says that, so new and unprecedented is our whole situation. There's no playbook for this. There's no blueprint for this. He says that we have to go into this knowing that we have to have a flexible plan. No one plan that any of us has is going to be the plan that will succeed. It has to be some amalgamation of them all. But, he says, and there's a huge but, he says there are certain principles that are inflexible. And I think that that's the great nuance of Lincoln, is there are certain principles that he is saying will allow you back into the fold, former Confederates, but only if you abide by these certain principles. And one of them he lays out is some of you may be legally prosecuted. Now, we know that by and large that doesn't happen ultimately. This is a great what if, is, what if Lincoln had lived? And a lot of people say, well, he's going to let the South up easy. Well, Lincoln did tell some people that
he let the South up easy.
He would want some people, lower ranking Confederate officers, Confederate enlisted men, by and large, he wants them to just go home, like come back into the fold. But for those of you who
drove the situation,
yes,
that's what I mean.
That's what we way oversimplify and get entirely wrong with Lincoln.
That's what I mean. It's like he'll let the South up easy, but like those who drove the Confederacy is different than the South.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And in that proclamation on December 8th, 1863, he lays out one huge contingent, which by this point in time, Lincoln never really becomes a full out-and-out abolitionist, but he gets very, very close to it in the last year of his life. And this is one of those moments, is now that he has issued the Emancipation Proclamation, there's this big question, when former Confederates come back into the Union, what will come of their former property, physical property? And Lincoln says, I think the concept that we have is that you'll get everything returned to you that's rightfully yours, with one big exception.
Yeah.
And that's enslaved property. If you have slaves, it's done. That system is done. And now we're moving, as we go into the campaign of 1864, this becomes a huge piece of the Republican Party platform. First time in American history that for a major political party, it's officially part of their platform to end slavery. And these are two different issues that we oftentimes think about in the same respect, is, what's the difference between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment? One of them frees enslaved people. The other one ends slavery. One of them, of course, is a presidential act during a time of war where he has the power to set people free in Confederate territories.
It's a war power, right?
It's a war power, exactly. You need to formalize that into law. And these are two different things. And Lincoln is starting to realize that by late 63, that we have to find some way to formalize this. Yes, we have freed enslaved people. Now we need to end the institution that enslaved them.
We have to stop the ability to continue doing it.
Exactly,
right,
exactly. So that's sort of coming out of 63, this great turning point of the war, this midway point of the war. But now, of course, we're entering the war's bloodiest year in 1864. And going back to that idea that I kind of left the thought unfinished of the sanitary fairs, why I feel like they're so important is because on these three occasions, in Washington in March, in Baltimore in April, in Philadelphia in June, we get the closest thing that we'll ever get to campaign speeches, if you will, for Lincoln that year. They're not political really at all, though. Not on their face. Lincoln's a shrewd politician, so I'm sure he has motives, of course. But they touch on these amazing social aspects of the war, and they do it in completely different ways from one to the other. So in just broad abstract terms, what a sanitary fair is, for anybody who might not be familiar, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the closest thing we could say that it's like today is it's sort of a mix between the American Red Cross. It does some aspects of like what FEMA does in modern times, even things like USAID. Like a lot of these things, this is the precursor to a lot of them. There's no private or government organization that exists quite like any of those things yet during the Civil War. So the Sanitary Commission is this public-private partnership that Lincoln admits that at its outset that he doesn't know if he's totally in favor of it. There's a big gender aspect to this. It's largely women-led, and so a lot of male political leaders are opposed to it just inherently because of that. They don't trust it. But also Lincoln says in this famous line, and it's the title of a book from the 1950s. It's called Lincoln's Fifth Wheel. He says that he felt something like the Sanitary Commission was like putting a fifth wheel on a four-wheel cart. He just felt like it wasn't necessary. But by the time we get to 1864, he is entirely pivoted on that because he realizes that the war effort has become so bloody and so costly that to supply all of the bandages, all of the manpower, all of the material, the medical department of the U.S. military just can't handle all of it on its own. And so organizations like the Sanitary Commission or the U.S. Christian Commission, these ladies' aid organizations around the country in small communities and run by states, all of these things are going to become extraordinarily valued by Lincoln. And the Sanitary Commission puts on these fairs, which are sort of equal parts fair, like a traditional fair like we would go to today, like a county or state fair. There's food and art and music. That's sort of the thing that draws people in. But then all the money that they're raising goes back into the war effort. And they're raising millions of dollars at these things that goes back into supplying the comforts of home for soldiers who were on the battlefield, in camp, and especially in hospitals as the war goes on. And Lincoln had received some invitations to speak at some of these that he had politely declined or hadn't responded to just because of the...
I'm busy, there's a war, in case you didn't notice.
Exactly. But he sees there's an opportunity to kind of really rally support for the war effort. And by the spring of 1864, that's extraordinarily important for him to do because the Gettysburg Address was what it was. It was seen as extraordinarily important in the quarters that it was. It had a call to action, but it was a relatively abstract defense of democracy.
Right.
With, of course, those calls for a new birth of freedom and making true Thomas Jefferson's words that all men are created equal. Well, Lincoln sees an opportunity in 1864, an election year, a year where he's going to have to rally support in this ever increasingly bloody war. And he'll take this opportunity to speak on some important themes. So I'll just read a couple of excerpts from these just to give us a taste of how this rhetoric is influencing public policy that year. So the March 18th one, which is the one in Washington, D.C., is relatively brief. It's off the cuff as best I can tell. I don't think his remarks are prepared. I'm going to give you the first piece of what the Washington Evening Star says, Pat.
All right.
And they're going to set up a little bit about a general here, and I'm going to see if you can guess which general they're referring to. So this is at the Patent Office, for those familiar with D.C. This is the location of the modern Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Yes.
So this is from the Washington Evening Star, March 19th, 1864. The hall was jammed with people on the occasion of the closing of the Great Patriotic Fair. An enthusiastic welcome was given to a general as he hobbled through the room on his crutches, advanced to the stand, and steadying himself by his crutches and the table, proceeded to say, "It is a noble work you are engaged in, honor given to the families of our brave soldiers while fighting our battles, the battles of the Republic and liberty. This year is apparently to be the great and critical year of our struggle. The coming campaign may be one of the most sanguinary and desperate of the war, but not too much so for the constancy of our troops or the sustaining of the power of the Union. The people of the country have full confidence in our chief magistrate," of course a reference to Lincoln, "and they hail the accession to the command of all our armies of a general whose name and history are guarantees of future triumph," a reference to Grant. "Let us stand by each other and sustain with generous confidence those upon whom the responsibilities of the government rest." So that is a U.S. Army general who introduces Lincoln. He is hobbling across the room on crutches and has to stand so that he's sort of leaning on a table to support himself as he's giving those remarks.
Is it Uncle Dan?
It is.
So I was like, who? Okay, as soon as you said crutches, I was like, this guy has no leg. It's not even that he's not hurt. He has no leg.
Yep.
But then I was like, who is Lincoln running against? It's McClellan. Who is on the list of people that doesn't really like McClellan? Well, Sickles is in there somewhere. So Uncle Dan, those were very nice words.
They really are.
I mean, those are really poetic words.
Yep.
Sometimes, like, I think about the visual of him sort of like gnawing on the cigar and just kind of being a jackass, not really following the plan, but like maybe working it out and then getting wounded. I always forget that, like, he was a politician.
Yep.
He probably knows how to speak very well publicly. That was a good job, Dan. Good job, Uncle Dan. I'm glad I got that right.
There you go.
I was about to be like, I'm sweating. What if I don't get this right?
100% of the times I've done this in front of audiences, somebody has gotten it. So
good. Okay.
It's like 6 for 6.
Well, I mean, here you have like me. So like, if I don't get it right, you're off in the wind.
And Dan Sickles, if anybody is not familiar, is this political Tammany Hall general who is controversial, most controversial for having been the 3rd Corps commander at Gettysburg, where he moves his line too far forward, many would argue, loses a leg in the process, and becomes, it seems, the first veteran of the Battle of Gettysburg who Lincoln ever talked to in person after the battle.
What a life lived when that's the most controversial thing that he's involved with. Because,
during the war,
I was saying killing Philip Barton Key, getting away with it because, oh, wait, I've never heard of this. You were temporarily insane? Wow, let's go with crime of passion?
Yeah.
I was like, wow, that's the thing he's most controversial.
I'd say that's the most controversial. But during the war.
In Lafayette Square, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the introduction of Lincoln. Now, this is what Lincoln says at that sanitary fair. I appear to say but a word. This extraordinary war in which we are engaged falls heavily upon all classes of people, but the most heavily upon the soldier. For it has been said, all that a man hath will he give for his life. And while all contribute of their substance, the soldier puts his life at stake, and often yields it up his country's cause. The highest merit, then, is due to the soldier. So we can see some of the themes that are, of course, wartime themes, but I would say this is sort of, in many respects, sort of a rough draft in this line and the ones that follow of what he says almost exactly a year later in his second inaugural. In this extraordinary war, Lincoln continues, extraordinary developments have manifested themselves, such as have not been seen in former wars. And amongst these manifestations, nothing has been more remarkable than these fairs for the relief of suffering soldiers and their families. And the chief agents in these fairs are the women of America. I am not accustomed to the use of the language of eulogy. I have never studied the art of paying compliments to women. I think an attempted humor on Lincoln's part there. The newspaper does not say laughter afterwards, so maybe it falls flat. But I must say, says Lincoln, that if all that has been said by orators and poets since the creation of the world in praise of women were applied to the women of America, it would still not do them justice for their conduct during this war. I will close by saying, God bless the women of America. And so we can see that there's a move toward gender here in the inclusion of women in the war effort. And this is really the first time that we have seen anybody on this scale in the federal government, certainly at the presidency, pay such homage to women. And this is sort of a carryover as well from the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln does not address women directly in that speech, but Edward Everett's speech does. And more than one person says that they see that as Lincoln is listening to Edward Everett's oration, Lincoln specifically breaks down and cries at one particular moment, and it's when Everett is talking about the women of America. And then there's a story in Lincoln's collected works, which happens, I think, around this time. I think it's spring of '64. He has a group of visitors to the White House, and he is specifically telling them, if you have not already, go read Edward Everett's speech at Gettysburg, and especially read his section about women. It made me personally emotional.
At times when things like that are pointed out, I wonder if what makes Lincoln's humanity is not that it's what makes Lincoln's humanity so special is not that it's his humanity itself. It's just that it's so well documented, because what I hear in that, what I think is most people feel human feelings like that, but we're not documented. People aren't talking about how we react to things. And so sometimes you'll disconnect from these things because you have your own humanity the same way sometimes you're caught off guard by a word said and it's just the impacts and things. But like thinking about that, it's like, that's another example of his humanity. And we always focus on, his humanity is part of this magic that has become the Lincoln legend and mythology and all these things. But it's like, I wonder if it's so well documented, his evolution on things, his humanity, that's what makes it special. It's like we can connect with it because it's documented.
I think so. And I think that it's more and more public, where it's in one respect heavily emotional on his part. He has not lost anyone personally in this war, to battle, but he has lost his son. He has lost children to illness. He has had a life full of this misery that one loss after another his entire life, that he's just able to be this extraordinarily empathetic figure. And he's surrounded by strong women in many respects. And in addition to throughout his entire life he had been, and in addition to the fact that Lincoln is basically admitting, I was wrong about this thing, the Sanitary Commission. And he doesn't outright say that there, but we now that we do know, looking back at his records from earlier in the war where he's like, I'm not so sure about this thing. This is him speaking at a fair in the nation's capital and saying, yeah, this is incredible what you all are doing here. And the reason why I think that's sort of a foreshadowing of almost exactly a year later that same month is, who does he talk about heavily in an emotional line in that second inaugural is the widows and orphans of this war. It's the women and children of this war. They have borne this war just as much as our soldiers on the battlefield, and especially those who have lost a husband, who have lost a father in the course of this.
And many of them didn't ask to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. A month later, then, Lincoln goes to Baltimore. And this is something else that is going to feature heavily in this campaign and this re-election effort is, of course, the issue of race. Not just slavery, but race and racism in America and in the American military. Now, Baltimore is an interesting place, of course, because of what had happened there in 1861 on two fronts. One, when Lincoln is going to Washington, D.C., he has to sneak through Baltimore to avoid a legitimate assassination plot. And then a couple of months later, we see, of course, the Pratt Street riots, violence that breaks out against federal forces where first blood is drawn in the streets of Baltimore. And Lincoln writes this draft that the Library of Congress has preserved. You can actually find this on loc.gov. There's a handwritten draft of a small piece of what he was planning to say in Baltimore, apparently at the Sanitary Fair, and he scraps. Fortunately for his sake, he scraps this because it's just lambasting Baltimore. It's basically saying, "Do you know how much trouble you caused me 3 years ago?" And you can really, another great life lesson from Lincoln is we know the number of times that he wrote something down, put it in a drawer, and then nobody finds it till after he died. This seems to be one of those cases. Somebody talks him out of it.
I love it because there's so many, how much trouble you caused me? Baltimore went to sleep one night and woke up with dozens of cannons on a hill staring at their business district. It's like, do that again, Baltimore, and I will bury you economically.
Exactly.
With 10-pound shot.
Exactly.
That's funny.
Yep.
You said lambast Baltimore. I'm like, we've done that on this show. I'm basically Abraham Lincoln. No, I'm just kidding.
So this, for context, is April 18th. So this is exactly a month after the last speech that we heard. If anybody, and I'm sure, Pat, you've probably been.
April 18th of 64.
64.
Okay, I was like, wait a minute. I was like, time out. We've time traveled. No.
64.
I got lost.
Yeah, we're just a month later.
Yeah.
The area in Baltimore today at Market Place, Rams Head Live, Baltimore Soundstage. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the area.
Been there, played there.
That's where, okay, awesome. So that's where this happened. That's where the Maryland Institute was at the time.
Oh, yeah.
That's where the building was. And that's where Lincoln is speaking. So in this speech, I don't know if you can pick up on this little Civil War trivia. We're talking about a major event that happens in Tennessee.
I like trivia.
In April 1864. Major tragic event that happens in April 1864.
A major tragic event in April 1864 in
Tennessee.
Dude, I might not get this one. Just let's in 64?
Yep.
Sultana. No, that's 65.
Fort Pillow.
Oh, the massacre. I was saying.
Yep.
On the other side of this room, there is a book called Fort Pillow to the End that was printed in March of 65. And it's one of my favorite things. It's like, this was printed before the war ended.
Wow.
But yeah, no, dude, I should have known that. And also, for the millionth time on this show, Nathan Bedford Forrest, fuck him. Anyway, moving on.
That's pretty much what Lincoln says right here. So,
okay, great. Great.
In so many words. So Lincoln has just learned of this, has just learned of Fort Pillow.
I forgot that was in April. That's what I got hung up on.
Sure, no, that's all right. And for many people in his audience, this is probably, they have just learned of it likely as well. And Lincoln speaks in a way that it's almost as if he's breaking hard news to a friend, is essentially how he treats this. And his theme on multiple fronts is this theme of the necessity of change, that in dire times, people have to change. You have to change the way you think about things. The government has to change its policy. And he goes on this marvelous discussion of the fact that our very conceptualization of what it is that we're fighting for in this war has changed. And he also talks about, and this is kind of how he massaged his initial thoughts on Baltimore, he talks about how changed things are in Baltimore, that 3 years earlier he had to escape through this town. And federal forces couldn't be there without having bricks thrown at them. But now he's saying, here we are 3 years later, and I, as the president of the United States, I'm standing here speaking at this magnificent, massive fair that is benefiting those very soldiers. So I'm sure that there is a line from this speech that even if you didn't know it was from this speech, and I'm saying this to you and to the audience, it's surely a Lincoln line you've probably heard if you've read much of Lincoln. I'll get to that in just a moment, but this is some of what he says. Ladies and gentlemen, calling to mind that we are in Baltimore, we cannot fail to note that the world moves, looking upon these many people assembled here to serve as they best may the soldiers of the Union. It occurs at once that 3 years ago, the same soldiers could not so much as pass through Baltimore. The change from then till now is both great and gratifying. Blessings on the brave men who have wrought the change, and the fair women, here we go back to the theme of gender, who strive to reward them for it. The change within Baltimore is part only of a far wider change. He's using it as a microcosm. When the war began 3 years ago, neither party nor any man expected it would last till now. Each looked for the end in some way long ere today. Neither did any anticipate that domestic slavery would be much affected by the war. But here we are. The war has not ended, and slavery has been much affected. And so this theme of change, Lincoln is saying, I had to change my entire concept of what this war was even about. I thought it was a war to bring the country back together. Now it's a war to destroy that old union and to build a brand new one. And he says, I thought for sure the war would be over by now. But
it's not.
But it's not. And
right.
So I've had to totally rewrap my mind around how we're dealing with any of this. Then he says this, and this is the line that you might have heard at some point in time. It's a famous Lincoln one, and it's applicable to today as ever. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here are two not only different, but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of these things is, by the respective parties, called by two different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces the same act as the destroyer of liberty. Hence, we behold the processes by which thousands are daily passing from under the yoke of bondage, hailed by some as the advance of liberty, and bewailed by others as the destruction of liberty.
Is Lincoln a scientist and this is the liberty paradox? Like, that's what he's talking about?
Yeah.
Like, everything is at odds with everything.
Everything is at odds. And if you are an enslaved person, to you, the federal government is your liberator, and your enslaver is the tyrant.
Right.
But if you're the enslaver, the federal government is the tyrant because they're taking away your liberty to own other people. And then right. Lincoln is saying that, we mean completely different things, and the people down there are saying the same thing as the people up here. And that's a tale as old as time, I think.
Dear God, I hope we don't have to kill what would be today the equivalent of millions of us to figure out what we went through in this moment in, the 1860s. I will tell you, if we can side rant for a second, the daily experience of what I do for a living as a look into the past and its relevancy alongside current events is so maddening right now.
Yep.
And most of that's because it makes sense because I focus my daily life in the 18th century, our colonial times and our independence revolutionary foundings. But here we are. And sometimes I think we forget what the Civil War is. It's either another revolutionary moment, or we had Jess Rowley on the show, who was a guide at Antietam Battlefield, and he talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the things that I took away from that I kind of like, you always know something and then somebody says it in such a way that you're like, aha, yes. And he talked about the Emancipation Proclamation really as an extension of the Declaration of Independence. Kind of like, I don't want to say his words as a part two, but just like, here was this idea in the 1770s. And here we are now with that same idea. We've spent 80 plus years with it. How has it changed? How do we need to change it? But and I loved but it's like, that's the Civil War is not just a war between the states and brother against brother. It's really this revolutionary, radical thing. And it's so much bigger. And again, our revolution was a civil war. Yeah. Complexities.
and along those lines, and I'll derail your tangent here as well. I was recently at a conference in DC, and there were a couple of the filmmakers who were part of Ken Burns' American Revolution, and they were talking about how while making it, they had this realization that from basically Lexington and Concord until the period between, we could say, beginning sort of in January of 76 with Thomas Paine's Common Sense and extending the next 6 months to the Declaration of Independence, where for the first year and change of this war, it's not officially about independence. It's about, liberating a set of colonies. And it suddenly was this aha moment for me as I'm sitting in the audience. I'm like, wow, that is super applicable to the Civil War.
I do this at work every day.
Yeah, because that is, for the first 2 years, essentially, of this war, at least year and a half until the preliminary proclamation, this is not a war for liberty as anyone is really conceiving it at the upper echelon of command. And it takes this one singular document and this, radical act and this set of words that, as Frederick Douglass would say in the aftermath of the war, he says proclamations and declarations and documents, those are very important, but they're only sealed with blood. And it's the combination of those two things. It's a shame that it sometimes has taken that, like it did during the Revolution and during the Civil War. But it is kind of amazing, the similarities, the parallels we can draw between the opening eras of those two wars are not at all about the thing that they would become. And that's exactly what Lincoln's talking about.
Dude, when I am engaging in a difficult histories conversation with a visitor at work, and as a frontline interpreter, you know what this is like. At a certain point, sometimes the conversation gets to like, dude, you're not picking up what I'm putting down.
Yep.
And then you got to like try a few quick moves or tap out. You're like, I'm running out of like runway. So one of my big moves is this. When we talk, we're very obviously deep in a complex conversation at that point, but I'll always say, like, if you want to know what, like, how crazy it is to think about this stuff all the time, I'll say, how was the American Civil War always about slavery, but not always about freeing the people held in the bondage of that enslavement? And before they can even answer, I'll say, forget that. That's pretty touchy. Let's put a different lens on it. I say, do you remember when we declared independence? And they're like, and by the way, what's jarring? How many people who are our age or older who are like, when was that? I'm like, dude, we've celebrated.
Yeah.
But so they're always like July 4th, 1776. I'm like, okay, do you remember when the war started? And they're like, well, and I'm like, Lexington Concord, shot heard around the world. They're like, oh yeah. I'm like, do you remember when that was? I'm like, April of 75.
Yep.
So the war started and then a year plus went by and then it became about independence. I said, that's what the Civil War is. It's always about this. It's always about this institution, but people's brains just friggin' I love that you just did that. Yeah. That's like my favorite thing to do to people.
That's awesome.
I'm on that wavelength every day.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm happy that if you consider that, I'm happy to be in your company, friend.
And it fits perfectly with this because that's exactly what Lincoln's talking about here. And we know he doesn't talk about the founders in this, but we know Gettysburg Address and beyond that's always something that's
it's in his
mind.
Yeah. All you have to do is forescoring.
Exactly. Right. As he says he's at Independence Hall on Washington's birthday on his way to D.C. in 61. And he's standing in Independence Hall and he says, I've never had a thought politically that did not stem from something that came out of this building. Everything about his concept of how democracy works, how the American Republic functions comes out of the founding era.
And they're living a lot more in relation to that founding era than we. Absolutely. Like, we never, sometimes I think we never lived in the 1776 Republic. I think that Republic died in 1861.
Yep.
Philosophically, I don't think we exist for 4 years. And then in 1865, right, a new birth of freedom with, it's codified in our Constitution and the war is over and blah, blah, blah. But sometimes I wonder if we're not even living in that country anymore.
Because I think that, that's only made more perfect by the events of the 1960s. And right. We're absolutely living in
some new third, fourth Republic version of it. Yeah,
exactly. Dude,
Lincoln's the man. I'm so happy we're doing this.
He can make us think in so many ways.
I'm so happy we're doing this.
So on the topic that I hinted at a moment ago, so we have this big idea of change literally where he's speaking, change in the course of the war. But then he pivots and he goes to a darker topic. And he says, and bear in mind, when people attend these things, they're aware of the weight of the place. It's benefiting the soldiers and wounded soldiers of the armies. But it's also fair. It's also this, very festival-like atmosphere. It's kind of jovial. It's artistic. People are buying stuff and eating good food. And then Lincoln drops this real truth bomb on them. And he says, a painful rumor, true I fear, has reached us of the massacre by the rebel forces at Fort Pillow in the west end of Tennessee on the Mississippi River of some 300 colored soldiers and white officers who had just been overpowered by their assailants. Having determined to use the black man as a soldier, there is no way but to give him all the protection given to any other soldier. If there has been the massacre of 300 there, or even the 10th part of 300, so he's saying even if there were 30
people,
of
them, yeah,
it would be conclusively proved. It will be conclusively proved. And being so proved, the retribution is the key part. The retribution shall as surely come. It will be a matter of grave consideration in what exact course to apply the retribution, but in the supposed case, it must come. So Lincoln is saying, we're pretty sure that 300 of our black soldiers and their white officers were just killed when they should have been captured.
Right, hands up, muskets are down, and they're rode in on, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yep. And he says, if we can investigate this and conclusively prove that it is true, which early signs are pointing that that is indeed the case, we will retaliate. We don't know what form that will take, but we will retaliate. And we can see this immediately take shape at all levels. Lincoln takes it back to his cabinet. He asks them all, what are your opinions? What should we do? And they sort of range, anywhere from don't do anything immediately, but keep this in your back pocket, to retaliate immediately, to let's issue a really stern warning that if this happens again, he gets all this feedback, as he does in so many issues from this team of rivals. As the saying goes.
I love that book too.
Yep.
Are the people that are sort of saying retaliate now, are they also passing along suggestions of what retaliation looks like? Like, at this point, has any vision of what retaliation taken shape?
Yeah, so Congress will launch this investigation. Let me find the exact dates here. And this kind of goes hand in hand with Lincoln's cabinet. So he writes to his cabinet on May 3rd. Meanwhile, in Congress, on April 21st, there's a resolution to inquire into the truth of the rumored slaughter of the Union troops at Fort Pillow. That's April 21st. By May 5th and 6th, they're issuing a report. So 2 weeks, maybe the most efficient Congress that has ever been. They will interview dozens of Union soldiers and witnesses who were there, and they come to the conclusion that this absolutely happened. And for both Lincoln's cabinet and for Congress, basically what the conclusion that they come to is that if we should retaliate, it should be 1-to-1. For every Union soldier, white or black, who you slaughter, who should have been captured, we're going to slaughter one of your Confederate soldiers or put them to hard labor. That's the other option that they give. And this goes back, actually, they had conceptualized that this might happen. Back in July 1863, Lincoln issues a general orders, which is oftentimes called the Order of Retaliation. And this is July 30th, 1863, General Orders 272. So when we think about the timing of when that was, July of 63, this is right after Fort Wagner,
right?
And Port Hudson, and all these places where black soldiers are engaging more and more. And Jefferson Davis and the Confederate Congress had jointly issued a statement, essentially saying that they would wholesale execute black soldiers if they should capture them. And
that's the scene in Glory, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Read the proclamation or the
totally
announcement.
forgot about that. Yep. Yeah. What Glory leaves out that's oftentimes forgotten is that Lincoln responds to that and issues this order of retaliation, and he hasn't really.
He says, "Try me, bitch."
Yeah,
No,
pretty much. Yeah. And he hasn't had to use it yet, but now all of a sudden Fort Pillow happens, and they have to actually consider, all right, so what do we do in this situation? Now, there's this series of events, and we could do a whole episode because it goes back and forth throughout 63 and 64, and now it's put to use. But basically, what they ultimately come to the conclusion on is Lincoln is going to write, I think I have it here, May 17th. He's going to write to Edwin Stanton this, in part. Please notify the insurgents. Lincoln never uses the term Confederates. It's always rebels, so-called Confederates or Confederacy, insurgents in this case.
But that's intentional because it's an act of delegitimize. Like, you're not what you say you are.
You're not a sovereign country.
Right.
You don't have military ranks. You don't have political offices.
Right.
You're all a piece of the United States. You're just out of your proper practical relations with the Union.
Yep.
So he tells Stanton, the Secretary of War, on the same day, mind you, that there's a 300,000 man draft. Another draft has been endorsed. Lincoln tells Stanton, please notify the insurgents through the proper military channels and forms that the government of the United States has satisfactory proof of the massacre by insurgent forces at Fort Pillow on the 12th and 13th of days of April last of fully white and colored officers and soldiers of the United States after the latter had ceased resistance and asked quarter of the former. He goes on to say that with reference to that massacre, the government of the United States has assigned and set apart by name insurgent officers, therefore, and up to that time held by said government as prisoners of war, that blood cannot restore blood, and government should not act for revenge. Any assurance, as nearly perfect as the case admits, there's a lot of legalese, obviously. He references the order of retaliation of the previous year, and he says that at the end of this, insurgents having refused to exchange or to give any account or explanation in regard to colored soldiers of the United States captured by them, a number of insurgent prisoners equal to the number of such colored soldiers supposed to have been captured by said insurgents will from time to time be assigned and set aside. So we're going to keep aside some Confederate soldiers who we're not sure if we're going to return them to you. We don't know if they're going to make it out alive. If
it depends on you.
Depends on you.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. And he specifically says that, the date of this is on the first day of July last, so dating back to July 1st, 1863. It will be assumed by the government of the United States that said captured colored troops shall have been murdered or subjected to slavery, and that said government will, upon said assumption, take any such action as may then appear expedient and just. However, Lincoln does not endorse this, and he apparently does not send it. So he doesn't sign it. Doesn't sign it, doesn't send it. It's one of these things that is found in the aftermath of his death. So it's an official policy he's sending to the Secretary of War to say, set aside certain Confederate soldiers who we can, prisoners who we can basically use to bargain if we find out that this sort of thing has happened again. But it never actually becomes official policy. And so there's never retaliation for Fort Pillow.
I was going to say, is that because, though, everything's fluid. Everything's quicksand, right? At the same time, these things are all happening. Grant's getting going over.
Exactly. So that's exactly where we're going
next. Is retribution just happening in a different way? Like, sure. It's just like, look, the meat grinder of the end of this has started.
So our guy, Alexander Hayes, who we talked about, obviously, at length.
Hayes, greatest of all time.
Greatest of all time. He writes this in a private letter. He says, the account, and bear in mind, he's radicalized by the war.
Well, this was my favorite part of that was how he starts with being like, yeah, it's not my thing. And by the end, he's like, dude, gotta free him, gotta end this, gotta kill all them, gotta shut this down.
The account from Fort Pillow, says Hayes, has caused much feeling among us, and it will recoil upon the rebels with terrible force. A student for many years, I am almost convinced of the divinity of ancient oracles. Certainly the atrocities of Fort Pillow will come within the range of whom the gods wish to destroy. They must first make mad. I almost feel like announcing, boys, I do not wish to be encumbered with prisoners, accounting for a massacre of Fort Pillow and numerous other outrages. I fear this contest is approaching without sparing, and we must bide the issue. Such scenes will be presented as never before blotted the fair face of creation, and the living will have tales of horror to tell that will curdle the blood of future generations. Our soldiers have coolly considered it and are willing to accept the hazard of the die. And
I love that.
It's so Lincoln doesn't take the initiative to officially enact the policy of retaliation, but soldiers they know what's happened, and they're going to take no quarter. And May 17th, when Lincoln doesn't send, but writes this note for Stanton, we're right in the midst of the Overland campaign by that point in time. Like you said, Grant's doing his thing. We're at the Wilderness, has already happened. Spotsylvania is in the midst of happening. And we're going to start to see a shift away from this matter of race in the context of the military in that regard. Meanwhile, though, of course, you have in the Army of the Potomac them fighting along, white soldiers fighting along black soldiers for the very first time in the key army in the Eastern Theater of the War, and they're getting a taste. Even those who were reluctant to allow black soldiers to fight alongside them, they're realizing, these guys can fight, and that'll continue throughout the course of that summer. And that really kind of sets up then the last of the sanitary fairs, and I've probably expanded on this way more than anybody wanted to. But
no, dude, if you're listening to this show by season 7, you're here for the meat and potatoes. Let's go.
But I think, as I've kind of alluded to, I think all goes into the thinking and feeling of the campaign, and then, of course, of that second inaugural. So the Philadelphia Sanitary Fair, Lincoln, oftentimes you'll hear, not often, but I've seen this a few times, you'll see, when Lincoln comes to Gettysburg, that's the last time he'll come back through Pennsylvania until his funeral train. But actually, he goes to Philadelphia in June of 64. And this is on June 16th at the Philadelphia Sanitary Fair. Now, you'll appreciate this, I think, Pat. There's this letter that Lincoln gets, and he probably didn't see it in time to actually speak because it's dated June 16th, which is the same date as his address. And it comes from a formerly enslaved black woman. We don't have her identity, but we can use context clues and we can figure out. But she does this really, really clever rhetorical thing where she says this. This is preserved by Library of Congress. This is another one you can find online on loc.gov. Look here, Father Abram. They say you're father of the faithful, but I shan't believe it unless you're faithful yourself. Don't you go and let old Sally Seward, a reference to William Seward, tempt you to turn us out into the wilderness, which is capitalized like the battle, without a pass, nor drive us from your bosom to sleep our last sleep on yonder bloody pillow, capitalized, meaning Fort Pillow, without even a rag of a flag to cover us. Haven't we served you well for many years as hewers of wood and drawers of water? Now I have been faithful, though I was only a bondwoman. That's the context clue we get there. To be sure, you have given us bread and a bottle of water, but you won't save us from death or starvation in the wilderness, again capitalized. And I think you'll be mighty mean if you don't do something to save us from the beasts of that forest. Capitalized F with 2 R's. Nathan Bedford Forest, not just the thing with trees. You'd better look out, I can tell you, for if they don't treat us better, we'll take possession of the land of Egypt and give you. Thank God there are wells even in the wilderness, and wells is capitalized with a second E, referring to Gideon Wells, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, even in the wilderness, and hunters capitalized like David Hunter fighting in the Shenandoah Valley.
There are way too many references. I feel like he's got to be sitting there with headphones on and like a beat going. He's like, I'm just dropping it. And it's like, exactly. In this name drop, Gideon Wells.
But she's so clever in how she's using, like she's totally.
I don't know why.
No, and she's like totally aware of all of these military players and the wordplay with it is amazing. And then she tells Lincoln at the end, now let the sanitary fair speak to you on our behalf. If you don't like to listen to any other fair one, she will tell you that black and white, it makes no difference to her. She nurses and tends to all without respect to color or party. Do you do the same, old Abe? I will be faithful to the faithful. And it's a little hard to parse some of those things. Just the rhetoric is a little hard to figure out exactly what she means. But basically it's this warning of, we formerly enslaved people. We know what's happening, and we're appreciative to the military, but you can't turn back the clock once this war is over.
Yeah,
you have to make sure that you're keeping an eye out for us as well. We're appreciative of these generals.
We're not a war pawn. We are people. You can't just say it. You have to remember it and do something.
So, and I think it's meant to be supportive of Lincoln, but it's meant to be also this message of let this fair speak to you, like gather something from this place. And that's something that we know that Lincoln did at Gettysburg, the number of times that he emphasizes the word here after having been there and visiting the battlefield and finishing the speech while he's there. And I think that's what this person is doing, is saying, like, don't just speak to the white audience out there who's concerned about, only the military affairs. Like, remember that there's a people whose very lives and livelihoods and liberty, depend on the results of this war. But I think the irony is the fact that this isn't even really a critique of Lincoln. It's just the reality because of what's happening that summer. Now we're into June. Now we're settling into affairs at Petersburg, and we're moving toward the election. So that's in mind as well. He just doesn't focus as much on the gender aspects and on the racial aspects in this speech. This becomes a very, very much a call to arms, a call to action for let's all go support our troops. And I'll read an excerpt in a moment here.
One of the threads of this show has always been understanding that a large portion of the people we interact with come to these stories or remain engaged in these stories through their access via pop culture. Yeah. Movies, film, songs, things like that. So go back to the Lincoln movie for a second. We already referenced this opening scene. Lincoln's talking to the 2 soldiers. They are veterans of Jenkins Ferry. Guy ends up quoting half of the speech back to him, and it's what they're doing is we kind of were musing on the how much that speech had already spread and things like that. But I also think maybe what they're doing, because movies and like they have different roles. Sometimes they have to compress timelines or condense things just to either make an entertaining film or make a point and whatever. So I kind of wonder if they're also kind of in that scene stressing this moment, because the point I take away from him remembering the speech and how he does that kind of like I'm stepping backwards, it is acting, right? All these things, but it's like, remember what is involved here. It's not just the union. And I know we've already talked, but like physically see me. And as you were kind of discussing this moment, I was like, this is a place you're going to see this is also in that scene in the Lincoln movie, I think, but it's poignant. But I just was like, this is, I think, of what I'm seeing in that moment.
That's a great point, and I think it's a stand-in for the conversations with Frederick Douglass. That
Right.
soldier is making in so many words through his actions, is making the same point. Douglass meets with Lincoln at least 3 times. The first time is to in the summer of '63 to protest against, or in favor for, I should say, equal pay for black soldiers and equal treatment for black prisoners of war, which fits right in with what's happening in '64. His second meeting in '64, which ties in with the campaign that's happening behind the scenes of all of this that we've talked about so far. Lincoln invites Douglass to basically go into the South and do a nonviolent version of what John Brown wanted to do. And Douglass can't believe what he's hearing from the president of the United States.
He's also like, what is a nonviolent John Brown?
But he wants him to go, basically go into the South, go to plantations, capture all of the enslaved people you can and bring them north before it's too late, because I don't think I'm going to win this election.
Right.
And so to segue into the Philadelphia speech here, and then we can talk about the conventions if you want, and the actual election and the second inaugural itself. So in Philadelphia, same kind of thing where he doesn't pan Philadelphia on this occasion, but there's a draft of the speech that's very different than the speech that he eventually gives. And he will pay homage to the ladies of the fair, as he calls them, who do give him a medallion. So he's getting gifts as he's attending these. This is the opening of this speech is another Lincoln line that even if you don't know where you've heard it from, you've probably heard at least part of it before. And he opens by saying this. Again, this is June 16th, 1864. So the armies have just arrived at Petersburg, essentially. War, at the best, is terrible. And this war of ours, in its magnitude and in its duration, is one of the most terrible. It has deranged business, totally in many localities and partially in all localities. It has destroyed property and ruined homes. It has produced a national debt and taxation unprecedented, at least in this country. It has carried mourning to almost every home until it can almost be said that the heavens are hung in black, and yet it continues. And so he's lamenting the fact that this war is going on, and it's halfway through its bloodiest year. Many of the casualties of 1864 are still yet to come, and now here we are a year removed from what many would have considered that great turning point of Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Lincoln is having to give much the same spirit of a speech he would have delivered a year earlier, or like he did at Gettysburg, but now I argue it's even more militant, it's even more brutal and blunt and honest, and he's saying, this war, it's awful. This is really, really bad, and it's touched everybody, but it continues. He goes on and he says, the Sanitary Commission with all of its benevolent labors, the Christian Commission with all of its Christian and benevolent labors, and the various places, arrangements, so to speak, and institutions have contributed to the comfort and relief of the soldiers. The motive and object that lie at the bottom of all of these are most worthy, for say what you will, after all, the most is due to the soldier who takes his life in his hands and goes into the fight to battles of his country. And he goes on talking about the importance of the soldier, the importance of businesses, and he talks about a national spirit of patriotism that is stronger than at the commencement of the rebellion. He thinks the American people have become more in favor of their country as a result of this war. We could argue, one way or the other on that.
I was going to say, studying any war, you've got a faction that's all in, and you got a faction that's like, dude, I'm so worn out. I just want it to end.
And I think that's the looking ahead to the election Lincoln right there. That's the politician. That's the political speak of, I don't know how you feel right now, but things are pretty good, right?
Yeah.
Things are looking up. Yep. And then he goes on to say this, and this is where he really dives into the war itself taking place that summer, literally what's happening on the battlefield. It is a pertinent question often asked in the mind privately and from one to another. When is the war to end? Surely I feel as deep an interest in this question as any can, but I do not wish to name a day or a month or a year when it is to end. And I've often wondered, if I were standing in that audience and I heard him say, we don't know what year this is going to end, that's got to be jarring to hear that reality. It's sort of like during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Lincoln throws out in 1858, he says, we may have to deal with slavery for a century more. And like, if I were standing in that audience to think about that reality of like, you think we'll still have slaves in 1958? In this case,
we will, brother. They'll just look different.
Yeah.
Like it will look different.
The system will look different.
The system will be different.
Yeah. And here, if I were standing in the audience in Philadelphia and I hear the president say, we don't know what year this war is going to end, that to me, that would probably be jarring. We've already been doing this for almost 4 years. How long do you think this will take?
I don't know if that would be, it would have to depend on the charisma and how it's delivered, because like, are we just lost in it? Or it's like, all right, I guess I'm in, but it's like, man, what a thing.
Yep. Yep. And then he goes on to say this right after that. I do not wish to run any risk of seeing the time come without our being ready for the end, and for fear of disappointment, because the time had come and not the end. We accepted this war for an object, a worthy object, and the war will end when that object is attained. So the dead cannot die in vain. This is a long way of saying essentially that. Peace is one thing; it's a noble prospect, but
peace has to mean something.
Peace has to mean something.
Yeah.
Those who have already died, their deaths have to have meant something for progress in the country. Under God, I hope it will never be. It will never be until that time. Lincoln says. Speaking of the present campaign, General Grant is reported to have said, "I am going through on this line if it takes all summer." Famous dispatch that Grant will send through the ranks, and Lincoln has got word of it. The war has taken 3 years, says Lincoln. It was begun or accepted upon the line of restoring the national authority over the whole national domain. And for the American people, so far as my knowledge enables me to speak, I say we are going through on this line if it takes 3 years more. So he takes Grant's line, I'll fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. And Lincoln says, I have a line too.
I'll raise you 20 million. We're doing it.
Yep, we're doing this for 3 more years.
Oh, my God.
I have never been in the habit of making predictions in regard to the war, but I am almost tempted to make one. And he knows where he is. And he says this, if I were to hazard it, it is this, that Grant is this evening with General Meade, a Pennsylvanian, and General Hancock, a Pennsylvanian, and the brave officers and soldiers with him, in a position from whence he will never be dislodged until Richmond is taken. And I have but one single proposition to put now. If I shall discover that General Grant and the noble officers and men under him can be greatly facilitated in their work by a sudden pouring forward of men and assistance, will you give them to me? And there's a great cry that comes out from the audience, a cheer. Then I say, says Lincoln, stand ready, for I am watching for the chance. And that's sort of how he concludes that speech.
Dude, I just want to hear you give Lincoln speeches. Because I know we can't hear Lincoln give Lincoln speeches, but I feel like you're the next best thing.
Well, thank you. I got to do the high-pitched Kentucky drawl.
Do you point out, did you like Daniel Day-Lewis's?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's, when I read Lincoln, that's what I hear in my head. A very, very close second, and depending on the context, maybe what I hear first is Sam Waterston. He's the voice of Lincoln in Ken Burns, and he did the miniseries in the early 80s, and he's the voice of Lincoln at the Gettysburg National Military Park at the Visitor Center. So both of them, I think, did a very, very good job with that.
I think Lincoln has become Daniel Day-Lewis for me now.
Yeah, anytime I'm
and he looks so much freaking like him.
Absolutely.
It was so weird.
Yeah.
So did you point out the fact that they're from Pennsylvania just because you're from Pennsylvania?
I did not. No, I pointed that out because he's in Pennsylvania.
I know.
I
just was like, because I know like you and your boys, y'all run Pennsylvania in the Civil War, and it's just like, I know it's a thing.
Yeah. No, I think, of all the hundreds of generals Lincoln could possibly point out, Meade,
he's picking out the hometown guys.
Yeah, and Meade's an Army commander, of course. And
that's politicking. He knows his audience.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, all right. So he gives, a relatively few, quote, non-political speeches that are obviously very political at times if you understand what's happening, things like that. But what is the purpose of all this? There's not just a war happening, but we are in a political season. Yep. The 1862 midterms, the 1864 presidential elections. Part of the backdrops of this war are its political comings and goings. And obviously in 1862, which is my, if I have a Civil War wheelhouse, it's the Maryland campaign through the Fredericksburg campaign. midterms, McClellan's removal, obviously huge thing, but here we are again. McClellan's a part of our story.
Yep.
He is the Democratic nominee. He is the opposition to Lincoln's Republican incumbency. So, this is a big moment because McClellan is very popular, and his sort of philosophy is very different. And we're talking about that portion of the population that might be just freaking worn out. McClellan's popularity is very powerful. So now we're actually going to talk, I guess, for a few minutes about the election, and then obviously we know he's elected, so I don't want to get it. Because I might want to do a different episode more in depth on that. Because what I really want to do is just take all this background and get to the second inaugural, and honestly, just kind of wing it from there. Because I don't know if we'll talk more philosophically about what could have been, what was definitely intended, how it relates to today. But I originally conceptualized this because, like a lot of us, very frankly, between you and I and all of our listeners out there, we, a lot of us are going through it because we not just are people of the world and people of this country, but a lot of us are professionals and live with a different set of knowledges and things like that. And it's been freaking maddening. And so I kind of just wanted to explore this topic with somebody that just, quite frankly, can steer me through my own thoughts potentially. And that might be helpful to some of our listeners. So let's talk about just sort of what the actual election looks like, because it's like you said, he's not out there digitally stumping the way that we do today, and in fact half of this country doesn't probably want him running around stumping in those states. So let's talk about that, and then he's elected.
So the thing with that's happening is that fits really nicely with all of the background I just gave of the other stuff that's happening, is that in June of 1964, so right before he speaks in Philadelphia, that's when the Republican, I'll put that in quotes because it's rebranded temporarily, the National Union Party, which is a clever move essentially to make, the Republican Party is a northern party, and there are pieces of the Confederacy that are very heavily unionist, portions of Arkansas, Louisiana, western North Carolina, a piece of Florida, northern Florida. The Battle of Olustee had happened a few months earlier, in part as an extension of this attempt, a failed attempt, but an attempt to start Reconstruction in pieces of the South. And so as Lincoln is speaking in Philadelphia just 2 weeks earlier had been the National Union Party convention, and it was in Baltimore. And so the platform, I'll just run through a couple of, it has 11 tenets, and I'm not going to quote the entirety of them, but it's a pretty radical platform. They're definitely trying to sway more conservatives, Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Oversimplification is to say that they flipped compared to now, but they've certainly realigned, of course. The National Union, the Republican platform, is several times they use the word liberal to describe themselves, and the Democratic platform uses the word conservative several times to describe its platform. So just in the context of its time, it's an important distinction. Neither candidate is at his respective convention, which is fairly common for this point in time. It's not entirely certain that Lincoln is going to be the Republican on the ticket. There are several people who are going to get votes. Salmon Chase, who was Lincoln's own Treasury Secretary, eventually becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John C. Fremont, who had been the Republican candidate in 1856, the first ever Republican presidential candidate. Benjamin Butler gets a lot of support. The Union General who coined the term contraband of war and sets the path toward the Emancipation Proclamation, and even Ulysses S. Grant, who was in command of all the Republic's armies in the field. There's also going to be this big question of who is the vice president going to be. It's not going to be Hannibal Hamlin.
We're out on Hamlin.
We're out on Hamlin. Yep.
Get out of here, Maynard.
And they're going to go the complete opposite direction. Can't have a New Englander do this, and so they're going to, of course,
get a Southerner.
Andrew Johnson, a Southerner. Yep.
Is he still serving as military governor of Tennessee at this time?
Yep, that's okay. I believe so. Yep. And the great trivia there, if anybody's not heard it, it's a pretty famous one. But he's the only senator from a Confederate state who did not secede with his state, a U.S. senator.
Oh,
and
so he has a spine.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Come on, you don't know me yet.
So there's a lot up in the air as far as who even is going to be at the top of the ticket, both president and vice president. And there are rare time, very very few times in American history where a president is eligible for re-election and both candidates are up in the air to some degree. It's also, this is a great tiny caveat to this, is Frederick Douglass actually gets a little bit of there's a murmur that Frederick Douglass could be considered as the vice presidential candidate.
Oh, that would be
awesome. What if of American history if we had gotten a black vice presidential candidate in 1864.
At that moment.
It doesn't gain any steam, but there are a couple of op-eds you can find in digitized newspapers. There are some op-eds from some editors who are saying, like, have we thought about this? Have we considered the
Dude, if you think conservatives melt down very easily right now. Oh, man. Oh, man.
So the platform. So let's talk a bit about the platform itself. It's written by Henry Raymond. So do you know who Henry Raymond was? So he was the editor of the New York Times. So if we want to, in our own time, think that our politics our media has never been as influenced by politics as it is now, the 1864 Republican convention says, "Hold my beer."
I'll say you've never heard of Horace Greeley.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So you could tell everything about someone by what newspaper they were carrying. The party platform is literally written by an editor of one of the country's
I've actually heard you do this on the local level. When we did this seminar, you talked about you could tell who people in Gettysburg are based on the paper they're reading.
Yep, exactly. So it happens here at the national level too. So here are the tenets of the Republican Party platform, the National Union platform. 1, to do everything in our power to aid the government in quelling by force of arms the rebellion and the war.
Okay.
It's an obvious thing to start out with. 2, prosecute the war with the utmost possible vigor to the complete suppression of the rebellion. So not only end the war, defeat the Confederacy. 3, this is where it starts to get radical. An amendment to the Constitution that shall terminate and forever prohibit the existence of slavery.
Wow, how progressive.
So very progressive for the moment. Yep. No major party had ever, abolition parties had put forth this before, but no major party had ever done this. 4, a provision for survivors who have received disabling and honorable wounds in the service of the country. This is the only provision that both the Republican Convention and the Democratic Convention have in their platform, is do something for the disabled veterans of this war. 5, this is important because this is after they have definitely decided on Lincoln, but of course, as we just discussed, this was a question up until the nominating process. 5, Abraham Lincoln has discharged the great duties and responsibilities of the presidential office, and they want him to continue to do so. 6, we deem it essential to the general welfare that harmony should prevail. So thinking about the concept of peace, not only end the war and defeat the Confederacy, but think about what a reunited country looks like. 7, the government owes to all men employed in its armies, without regard to distinction of color, the full protection of the laws of war. So this is the first time that any national party has ever put that in there. Anything about equal protection under the law. In this case, it's very specific to the men who are in the military. 8, foreign immigration should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy. The Republican Party wants a liberal policy on immigration.
Doing progressive thing. Oh, yeah. When you say it like that, friend, did you hear the melting down just start happening?
I'm just going to leave that at that. Yeah. 9, and then this is a reminder that though the Civil War is the most important thing happening in the country, it's not the only thing happening in the country.
Never is.
We are in favor of the speedy construction of the railroad to the Pacific Coast, Transcontinental Railroad. 10, the public debt must be kept inviolate, and for this purpose, we recommend a vigorous and just system of taxation. Lincoln talked about in one of those sanitary fair speeches, like, we've never had to pay more taxes than we do now because this war is a very, very expensive thing. And the Republican Party is realizing, we're going to have to deal with that in some fashion. And finally, 11, the United States can never regard with indifference the attempt of any European power to supplant by fraud the institutions of the Republican government. There's, of course, a big question throughout the whole middle of the war. Will France and England come in on the side of the Confederacy? They're saying we need to keep an eye on that. We can't have foreign powers perhaps meddling in our elections.
And we've already had the Trent Affair, which I'm sure has not helped that conversation.
Exactly. Yep. So that's the Republican platform and what's going along with it. On the Democratic side, which is much, much briefer, I'll address that really briefly here. They only have 6 tenets. George McClellan's not there, just like Lincoln was not at his. There is some question as to whether it will definitively be McClellan. I'll admit offhand, I don't know offhand who the other considerations are, but McClellan is extraordinarily, he is not inclined to accept this nomination after he reads this platform, and we'll talk about why that is here momentarily. But these are the tenets of the Democratic platform, which is in Chicago, and I forget the exact date of this. We will adhere with unswerving fidelity to the Union under the Constitution of the United States. And I think it's telling that they had to put that into their platform as the number one thing. Like, yeah, we'll obey the Constitution because, Copperheads, there's a lot of question as to whether that's happening.
Right.
Now, though, they could also flip it on its head and say Lincoln and the Republicans, are suspending habeas corpus. They're not really abiding by the Constitution.
They have war powers, bro. What is that?
Yep. 2, 4 years of failure to restore the Union by the experiment of war demand that immediate efforts be made for a cessation of hostilities. This is the point that McClellan, especially as a former leader of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in this war, he is not comfortable with calling it 4 years of failure because he doesn't know if he can go look at those men in the eyes who he just led and who are still fighting in this war. He doesn't know if he can go tell them that he's the candidate representing a party that feels as though what they're doing is an abject failure. And
also, his own personal vanity is probably like, you can't define what I've done as failing. Like, other people failed. I would have won if you gave me the troops or gave me the supplies or the whatever. So
perhaps, yeah.
And that's the complexity of McClellan, is the vanity alongside the genuine affinity for his men. I mean, McClellan, I think people forget, again, human, you can be both of these things. I think McClellan is this vain person the narrative has taken off with him to be. He's also, I think, very aware of the condition of his men, and I think he feels it legitimately.
And I think he feels legitimately that regardless of the end goals that he's in favor of versus what perhaps he feels the Lincoln administration is prosecuting, he's still a proud wearer of the United States military uniform, and he is a proud United States Army general who makes it very clear that he wears this uniform for a purpose, and he's going to hold that military rank over any sort of aspiration for politics. That's one thing that I think that we use McClellan way too often as the butt of the joke, and
I would agree with this
for good reason. In some instances, he's not a likable guy in the grand scheme, but I think that we paint with too broad a brush in that regard. And I think in his political aspirations, this is certainly one area where I think anybody who seeks office, even those with the best of intentions, there's a lot of ego involved in that, and there certainly is here.
There has to be.
But there has to be, to feel as though you are able to command the audiences that you do and wield the power that you would if you are elected. But it's not a responsibility that McClellan ever really wants for himself, as we so often see with any of the generals who ultimately run for president, all the way from Washington to Grant to Eisenhower. I'll throw McClellan into that. It's very, very reluctantly.
So, but that's not the narrative of McClellan. Now, we won't do the narrative of McClellan episode today, but the narrative is that he's just looking for glory so that he can chase his political career. And then once he's out of command, it's just the gloves are off and I'm going to kick Lincoln's ass politically. And then, I think a lot of our listeners today are going to just learn for the first time that Lincoln or McClellan wasn't even the person they were fully behind. There could be other people, things like that, other choices. Yep. He might not have been invested. This layer of the onion of understanding, he's are we failing?
Yeah.
Can I say that? Do I believe that? But I think you'll appreciate this. A few years back, when I was sort of opening my eyes, you could say, becoming wide awake myself, just at how I look at the American Civil War, how I look at the study of history, and we're talking a decade or more ago now at this point. But just this thing that happens with the Civil War and its mythology, where we create, and not just the Civil War, but for what we do, it's the Civil War, right? We have Stonewall Jackson, Grant, Lee. We have all these huge things, these huge people. We put them on these pedestals, and we forget they're humans. We forget they do all the things we do. But Jackson has never done any wrong. Never once messed up on the battlefield. Not once. Certainly never took a nap accidentally during, the summer of 62 and didn't end up at a fight, right? None of these things have ever happened, right? So I started thinking about it. It's look, Jackson definitely pulls off all these great things, but to humanize him, what's the balance? What does he mess up? So I started looking at those things. Then I started thinking, well, all right, I don't want to beat up. If I want to be objective, I can't just beat up this one place. What's an inverse place or an opposite? And it's okay, we heap praise on Jackson, we never throw criticisms. Well, we throw nothing but criticism at McClellan. Mm-hmm. What does he get right? And I found it opening some weird parts of my brain that I'm like, am I an apologist now? Like, or am I just a realist? But this highlights sort of that thought that I think I went through and a lot of people are, is like, it's also the season of what's the season right now? Like, is it my political season? Whatever. But I think it's interesting that McClellan is wrestling with this. So I want to ask a quick question. I want to point something out I wanted to point out earlier. But once the election is wrapped, Lincoln is elected, and we can talk about how the actual election works because he's not on Southern state ballots, things like that. Is McClellan like not necessarily a gracious loser, but is he like, okay, I wear this uniform proudly. This guy won the election. It's go time for the finish the mission. Yep. Is that who he is?
Yep. Basically. Yeah. Okay. He'll accept the nomination. And I think it's about a week after this. Doesn't do much to campaign, but that's just the nature of the era. They're not really campaigning until the 1880 election. We see that a bit in Death by Lightning. Garfield.
Oh, that was so good.
The porch campaign. It really was. It was so good. Yeah. So good. But well, what was I going with that? That McClellan, Lincoln is so certain that McClellan is going to win, and fearful that that everything that the war effort has become by this point is going to be turned on its head when McClellan takes office. That Lincoln famously will issue this blind memorandum where he asks all of his cabinet officials to sign a document that they can't see the front side of, and he flips it over, and when you flip it over and you read the other side, it is I thought I had it here, I might not. It is Lincoln saying, if things don't go our way in this election, if the other side wins, and then he writes this before he knows it's going to be McClellan, but it's pretty clear it's going to be McClellan by this point in time. He says we need to do everything we can in the lame duck period to ensure that everything we have fought for, we can leave it in as good a position as possible to lay into the hands of my successor. And B, we need to aid my successor for the better nature of the country. And for all intents and purposes, it appears as though, despite his flaws, despite his ego, McClellan is very much in that same vein as well. He's going to accept all of that to say both men are going to accept the results of this election, which is not a foregone conclusion. A, that they will accept the results, or B, that the election will happen at all, because it's never happened in the history of the world that a country held a national election for its chief executive in the middle of a civil war, in the middle of a wholesale rebellion. And but yes, to answer your question for what it's worth, yep, McClellan accepts these results, and to fast forward to election day itself, it's November 8th, 1864, and Lincoln wins wholesale. The popular vote is relatively close, but the electoral vote is 212-21. And,
wow.
And he cleans house with, I think it's nearly 70% of the soldier vote, which is what Lincoln is least confident in. And, some in the press, in the Democratic press, will raise concerns over the legitimacy of soldier ballots. They're raising questions as to whether mail-in voting is a legitimate way to cast a ballot. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And but McClellan, for his sake, he resigns his commission. I forget exactly when, but shortly thereafter, he resigns his commission from the Army. And he takes his family to Europe for a while, and that's basically that's how he treats the results. And a lot of people on his side will then realize, looking back on the past few months, they'll say, "Oh, maybe he wasn't our guy. Maybe it seems like he may not have actually had his heart set on this."
Yeah.
But Lincoln is fully prepared to lose and is willing to accept that. Obviously, laments that. It feels as though there's a lot of work to be done, but puts all of the pieces in place to prepare the country for a McClellan presidency. And if that had happened, I think Lincoln will genuinely wish him the best and do everything he can to ensure the betterment of the country going forward. But yeah, McClellan accepts those results with grace.
Do you ever just find yourself randomly thinking about William Seward?
From time to time.
See, I feel like that's a weird question to ask normal people. But if you have brains like ours, it's not. So the other week, did you find yourself thinking about William Seward by chance? Talking about a little modern political commentary? I was listening to the ramblings of POTUS, and he was talking about the greatest business deal in the history of our country. And I was like, I'm pretty sure the acquisition of Alaska outranks that. Like, to go from Seward's Folly to, like, thank God we have all that oil. Like, I'm pretty sure that's the best. But I was like, how often do you randomly just go, thank God for Bill Seward on a random day? Like in 2025.
Yeah.
So,
that's
when you mentioned Sally Seward earlier, I was like, I was, for no reason at all. Like, only people like us. But I'm like, I was thinking about Bill Seward like a week ago.
Is Seward your Roman Empire?
Yes. I think about the Roman. What if he was Caesar in the Roman Empire? All right. So the election plays out.
Yep.
He's not on the southern states. How does it work, with the electoral process, the electoral college? Like, how does just in a short sense, because I want to get to the actual speech.
Yeah.
And I want to sort of wind down with just sort of our thoughts on Lincoln's intentions, the vision, how it's been carried on, how it's not been carried on, and just I want to kind of move towards end with that. But the election is, like you said, it's never happened in the history of the world at this point. We are engaged in a great civil war, but yet the Republic perseveres. Yeah. So how does it actually play physically out? Like, what's the actual process? Half the states are involved. That's it.
Yeah, half the states are involved. There's a borderline constitutional crisis in some pockets of the Confederacy, those unionist pockets, especially those that are under federal control. There are a whole bunch of ballots, for instance, in Tennessee that I know pop up in the collected works of Lincoln. I think some parts of Louisiana and Arkansas as well that come to mind, but that they're not counted because Lincoln has this concept that the Confederacy doesn't actually exist as a sovereign entity, but that's at odds even with some people in his party. Thaddeus Stevens, for instance, right. In Congress, he sees, nope, the Confederacy is a belligerent nation. We need to treat them as a people that we are going to conquer. And then in some of those states, there's this line in the movie Lincoln that I don't think is an exact quote, but the spirit of it is certainly something that Lincoln said on many occasions, where he says, the laws of those states in some respects don't remain intact, or something along those lines. And that, as we all know, after recent history, elections take place at the state level, not at the federal level. And so that concept of the Confederacy existing or not is open to interpretation based on whatever state you're talking about. And so there are many locations where we'll see that people who thought that they were legitimately voting, who were proud unionists who are loyal to the United States, are thinking they're voting for the president, and they're not able to. And the contradiction of the fact that Andrew Johnson is himself from one of those states that was declared to be an open rebellion. People who were his constituents couldn't actually vote for him, or did vote for him, but then it wasn't counted.
It wasn't counted.
Yeah. So, and then you have the whole aspect of the soldier vote and how that's carried out. I think in some locations, and I'm not an expert on this, I may be misrepresenting this, but my understanding is that it was, in those cases, was a verbal roll call, I'm pretty sure. I don't think that there actually is like a paper ballot, like a typical vote, polling place. And when you went and voted, if you were just a regular citizen who was able to vote, it would have been very apparent to everybody who was there who you were voting for, because you're just dropping the literal, that term, the ticket, top of the ticket. It's a literal ticket that you're folding and you're putting into whichever jar, bucket, box that is the candidate of your choice. So you're going to see who all your neighbors are voting for when you're there at your polling place. And likewise, soldiers in the ranks, they're going to know who everybody around them is voting for. And there's, I've read some theories that is going to be something that has a positive impact upon Lincoln, is that all these soldiers don't want everyone around them to know, even if they secretly did want to vote for McClellan, that they don't want everybody else around them knowing that that's the case. And so it's open to interpretation, but sure. But it's a very, very different process than what we do today.
So does the electoral count remain the same through the Civil War? Obviously, with the southern states attempting to form their own confederacy, they're allegedly removing their electoral votes from the process of this. Is the electoral count Lincoln needs the same as he needs in 1860?
I think it changes a little bit because of West Virginia. So West Virginia accounts for 5 electoral votes. I don't know what the overall of Virginia would have been in 1860.
I was going to say, so let me rephrase that. So do the original electoral votes still all
Yeah, they don't.
There's just additional ones because of Nevada, because isn't it 2 states? Everybody always thinks it's just West Virginia, but I think Nevada is officially made a state.
Yeah, you're right.
In 1864 as
well.
That
is 60. Yep, and that's worth 2 electoral votes. I have the map pulled up here. Yeah, and then Louisiana gets 7 electoral votes for Lincoln, and Tennessee has 10. But so they went to the overall count, but it's like I said, it's pockets of those. But that's a good question. Yeah, I'll have to look that up. What is the threshold in 60 versus in 64? Because even though there obviously would not have been another census.
Because how do you get the votes out of South Carolina?
Yeah, exactly.
like we could talk. Tennessee folds like a house of cards immediately in the war. So okay, but like South Carolina, starts the war, stubbing to the end, right? Where are those votes?
Yeah, exactly. And you can't like redistrict between census, right?
No, dude, it's totally like unprecedented to do that. All right, so. But whatever, Lincoln crosses the threshold.
Yep.
And he is elected I guess he's still the 16th president of the United States, but to a second term.
Yep.
And that is November of 64. So we are well into the lines established at Petersburg. They might not recognize it yet, but we are in the twilight of this war. The lines are where they're going to be until they inevitably retract to nothing.
And there is not only a hope, but a real feeling about that. And I've done a lot of work on winter encampments. And one thing that I've done in that is sort of looked at the feeling in camp at the holiday season, especially. What are guys writing about Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's? And Christmas of 63, Thanksgiving even, you start to see men saying, this will probably be my final Christmas in the Army. Like they can feel it, that there is this, obviously it's aspirational, it's hopeful, but they've never written that before.
That's not the macabre, I'm going to die. That's the this time next year I'll be home.
Yes, exactly.
I'll be home.
Yeah. Yep. I'll be home. Yep. I'm going to see you next Christmas.
So, all right. So when he is elected, before we get into he's now got a plan for this inauguration and things like that, just what is the general sense? Is it just relief, or is it like, okay, enough of that? Like, just got to continue this work? Like, what is sort of that moment? Because, we've been talking for the last few minutes about all these things that are kind of up in the air, whether it's the party nominations to the I might not carry the soldier vote to I might not win this, like sign this paper that you haven't read, which just, dude, what a ballsy move. Like, I don't feel comfortable doing that. Yep. But now it's over. He's won the election. Yep. How does that news reach him? How quickly does that take to play out? And then what is his immediate reaction?
It's a very quick vote count because it's so decisive. It's reminiscent of a lot of the latter 20th century, votes that we have. We live in an era, of course, in the 21st century where, I suppose with the exception of 08 and 04, 08, and 12, we're all relatively decisive. But starting with 2000 and then all of our past 3 elections, we're waiting either well into the night or for days or for weeks or for a Supreme Court decision. It's like there's a large period of the 20th century where it's pretty decisive, and there are many elections like that at this point as well. And because because McClellan only picks up 2 states, I'm pretty sure. It's either 1 state or 2 states. It's New Jersey and Kentucky is all that he carries, and maybe Delaware, New Jersey, Kentucky is all he takes. So it happens pretty quickly. I should know, but I don't offhand know how the news reaches Lincoln. But one would presume either at the White House or at the War Department, because he's there so often that's where he's receiving a lot of his telegraphic news. But I don't know that offhand. That's something I should know. That's readily accessible information, I'm sure.
So a big rabbit hole for a different day, but one I want to jump in with you specifically is all these things about Lincoln that he does that we don't think about. Like we talked earlier in this episode about, Lincoln hasn't lost anybody in this war, but he has experienced loss. He buried a child, things like that. In that atmosphere, a good portion of the beginning of his presidency is not spent in the White House because of, this whole thing. So I kind of want to jump into this sort of like Lincoln and sort of like he spends a lot of the war at the War Department. Like they do show it in the Lincoln film. He's, for the Fort Fisher assault, he's kind of sitting there waiting. That is my favorite scene in that whole movie. Because I think that's when Edwin Stanton just snaps and it's like, I can't hear another one of your stories. Yep. Also, Kylo Ren is randomly in that scene. Like it took me probably 8 years to realize, I'm like, oh my God, that's Adam Driver. Like what? He looks so good in Federal Blue at that time too. So, so I just, I love this concept of like Lincoln and where he physically is during these moments. Like the Maryland campaign, a lot of these things are kind of being chaired from this private home, not the White House at times. But anyway, I digress.
One thing when you just said about the movie that I did not answer in your previous question, I forgot about it, and that reminded me is the efforts that Lincoln is now putting forth now that he's been reelected. He's full steam ahead on let's push Congress to a constitutional amendment for the abolition of slavery. I'll sign it. Yeah. And that of course is the fight that we see,
the movie. It's the plot of the film.
It's the plot of the film, exactly. And that first great monologue that we see from Lincoln, at the table with the cabinet where he's talking about, the future of millions yet to come, and he's telling the story as he's, whittling the stick of wood and talking about the mandate that he's gotten from the American people, that he issued an Emancipation Proclamation, and he says in that moment, he's like, what is it, 2 odd years ago or something like that, and yet they reelected me. And so I'm going to take that as, and the fact that, as we just heard a moment ago, the party platform says we don't only stand for the emancipation of the enslaved, we stand for the abolition of the institution that enslaved them, as we talked about earlier. Shut the whole thing down. Just do it right now. Yep. And he's going to go full steam ahead on that, and full steam ahead on, if it takes 3 years more, like let's end this war and end this system of slavery. I don't think we really see any tactical change necessarily on Lincoln's front from before Election Day to after Election Day. It's just a matter of, okay, here we go. Now we are full steam ahead. Let's go do the things that we were hoping to do. But I contend that I think even if he had lost, he's going to take that lame duck period, which is nearly 4 months at that point in time. He's going to go try to do those very things before McClellan takes office.
So looking now at the inaugural itself, because I want you to read it, in its entirety. But one of the things that I think is also going to be important to note is, like, especially for the people who are living very aware of the last several presidential cycles and have listened to how we give inaugural speeches, whether it's, so like in my adult lifetime, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, those are the guys I've heard give inaugurals. And again, varying levels of whatevers, but they've all, even in the most idealistic, nostalgic moments of what I would personally say is like Obama's first inaugural, there's still this, I almost feel this disingenuous modern politicization of just the world we live in. This inaugural you're about to read feels very different, but I also feel like is very mindful of these political things, and I think that's part of the mastery of Lincoln. But like, did Lincoln set out to write something greater than just an inaugural political speech? Like, did he set out to be like, I'm going to write this moment-defining thing? Or kind of like the Gettysburg Address, did it just happen? Did he just hit the right notes because he was being honest?
I think it's a little bit of both. Lincoln more than...
Like, he's not an idiot. He knows his moments.
Exactly. He knows his moment, and he knows his place in posterity. And, one of the great unanswered questions is, where exactly does Lincoln land on his faith? And that has a role in this because he invokes God so many times in the second inaugural and in the Gettysburg Address, and he apparently adds under God ad lib. Why I bring that up right now is not randomly, but because Lincoln doesn't have any sort of traditional Christian doctrine, but what he does have, he doesn't know where he lands on the afterlife or, whether there's a heaven or a hell. But what he does know is that as long as you're remembered by the people of the earthly living world, then some version of you continues to go on. He sees it in this really kind of ethereal, abstract way. And from the Emancipation Proclamation to the Gettysburg Address to the second inaugural, there are these moments where people around him talk about, he's starting to talk about those things more. And so I think it's a little bit of both. I think he knows that it has a purpose. And all inaugural addresses do and will, and in this case, even in Lincoln's case, we oftentimes forget the opening of the speech. It is political. It is very much a defense of his policy, because when we think about, what is a inaugural address supposed to do, it's supposed to lay out an idealistic version of of the nation, to the people who voted for you and who did not vote for you, because now suddenly in that moment, you're not the candidate of one half of the country, you're the president of all.
Yes.
But
did you hear that? You're the president of all. Anyway.
But you do need to, as well, lay out specific policy positions. And the two speeches that I would say I think we do this to the most, what I'm about to say, would be Lincoln's second inaugural and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. So opposite ends of the National Mall. We think of the I Have a Dream speech through
Oh
that
my
lens.
God, I've never fucking thought about that, Cody.
We think of the end of it.
But no, just the fact that they are two speeches
they're facing
given
each other.
literally on the opposite ends of the same place. Like, that's profound in and of itself.
Yes. Yep.
Dude, whoa.
Yep. And we oftentimes think about, and this has been my big project of the year that I've loved doing and would love to come talk about it at some point, is how the ways that Martin Luther King used the American Civil War and Lincoln especially. And many people, himself included, the way he opens that speech 50 years ago, he viewed it as his Gettysburg Address. Something of a Gettysburg Address is how he referred to it to a reporter when he was working on it. But I hold it as, in our memory, being similar to Lincoln's second inaugural. We remember the end of the I Have a Dream speech, the I Have a Dream refrain, at the expense of forgetting the first part of it, which is the truly radical piece of it. It's the uncashed check. It's all about reclaiming the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation. It's very political. It's very of its moment, but also timeless. And with the second inaugural for Lincoln, we remember the last two paragraphs. We remember the with malice toward none, with charity for all. We remember the pieces going, as we've gone many times now, back to the movie. We remember the pieces at the end of the movie, but we do that at the expense of forgetting the beginning, which is a wholesale defense of the fact that this war was about slavery. And he basically is saying there's a piece of the country that's about to tell you that this is not about slavery, it's about slavery. And the end of the last two paragraphs, anybody across the political spectrum then or now could objectively look at that and say, yeah, that's good. That's what it means to be an American. But the first part of the speech is what some people will have an opposition to. And once again, much like Gettysburg, though this is 4 times the size of the Gettysburg Address, it's still a very small speech. It's 800 words or something like that. As inaugural addresses go, it's on the shorter end. Looking at you, William Henry Harrison.
Right. Yeah. I was getting ready to say, I was like on the lengthier side of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think rumor has it he's still talking.
He might be.
He might be going still. All right, so you just want to read it?
Shall we?
Yes, go ahead.
Let's do it. Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement somewhat in detail of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of this great contest, which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to any man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Finally do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
Brava. That was incredible.
The religious part there, stumble over the words because he throws in a couple Bible passages and it's like, where are you going with this, Abe? Yeah.
So, a moment of levity before we get back into our discussion. So, I forgot that he talks about to bind a nation's wounds. Like 15 years ago? No, longer. This is like my second time ever going to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick. Our friends Dana and Melissa, amongst others, and your buddy Jake, obviously our buddy Jake.
Of course.
Used to, basically cut his teeth there, things like that. I remember one day I went there. I actually think it was the day I went there to do a short video with Jake, but I was standing in the gift shop and I was looking at these, they had these Abraham Lincoln Band-Aids. Are you familiar with the product?
Oh, I am. I have some.
You might already be, since we were on this wavelength earlier, you might already be on the wavelength I'm about to go to. But it literally, on the box, one of the things was the quote is to bind a nation's wounds. And they kind of, I think, also said I'll bind your wounds like a nation's or whatever, right?
I'll bind your wounds like I bound the nation's or something.
Wounds. Yes, but I knew that they took it from this.
Yeah.
But my brain at the time, because I'm such an asshole, was like, does it work on head wounds? But as soon as you said bind a nation's, I was like, oh, I forgot that product existed, and I'm supposed to come out of this and do something serious. I was like, you know what? No, I'm going to acknowledge this, and then we'll get serious. Yeah. But I knew you knew, and you knew about the You have the Band-Aids.
Yeah, I got them for either Christmas or a birthday a few years ago.
Oh my God!
I may have used all the Band-Aids, or maybe I kept one for posterity, but they came in a cool little tin, so I at least have that.
Oh, that's awesome. So, how is this speech received in real time? Not just with the audience that physically heard it, but this is so where I was misinterpreting the context of the letter written to Lincoln earlier, I thought that was a speech. This is most assuredly a speech. This is likely printed, published.
Absolutely.
So what is the reaction to this?
Well, I didn't think about pulling this up, but I'm going to pull it up so I can pull up the exact name of the article here. But if anybody wants to read more about this aspect, this was from 5 years ago, so March 4th, 2020, so the 155th. I did a piece called How the Pennsylvania Press Reacted to Lincoln's Second Inauguration. This was on PennCivilWar.com, Pennsylvania and the Civil War. And this is obviously just looking from Pennsylvania perspective, but if memory serves, with having not looked at this in a few years, I think what I did was I looked at Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, as obviously the two.
There's
big
other
cities.
places in Pennsylvania.
There are
other
Yep.
places.
Yep. Philadelphia on one side, Pittsburgh on the other, and Alabama in the middle. If you've ever heard
Did
that
you
one.
ever see? I don't know if you watch the show, but did you ever see the bit from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where they're talking to Charlie about there is another city in Pennsylvania?
I have not.
And he's like, "What are you talking about?" They're talking about Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, it's like a 5-minute scene where his brain cannot grasp that there's more to Pennsylvania than Philly.
That's great.
I'm sending it to you tonight.
That is please do. That's a show that I think I started watching like the first season, the first time it was on Netflix. Then it left Netflix, and I just never continued with it. God. And I absolutely need
that. That is a lifelong favorite of mine.
Yep. It's right up my alley.
But that's why I went with it. It was like, there's more? Because at one point, like, all the rest of them were like, oh, yeah. I mean, but then there's that weird stuff in the middle.
Yep.
Alabama.
Yeah. So I think what I did in this article, you'd think I'd know because I wrote it, is Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and then I looked at Chambersburg and Gettysburg as, center of the state, south central of the state,
cool,
and the towns that have dealt most directly with the war. So I'll just let me scroll through this and give you a couple of reactions here. It's pretty much along partisan lines. It's a classic case of we can mostly all look at it today and see the genius in it, but if you're a Republican in the moment, you're going to like it. If you're a Democrat, you're not going to like it. By and large, that's sort of how it's received. 798 words for anybody who is curious. The actual speech itself. Pittsburgh Daily Commercial. Today, enthusiastic and confident crowds representing every loyal state in the United States assembled to witness the reinauguration of the man who 4 years ago, in defiance of the threats of traitors, was installed in his high office at the point of the bayonet. In Washington, both sides of the street were completely jammed by those eager to see the president. In his unassuming way, Lincoln came in full view of the throng, as a loud and enthusiastic cheer welcomed him, with many repetitions that seemed as though they would not be checked. As the commotion subsided, privileged visitors to the Senate chamber clustered on the portico and at the windows, and in the universal hush, the president addressed them. So, pretty favorable. It's a Republican paper there. Meanwhile, the conservative Democratic paper, Pittsburgh Daily Post, talked about the weather, which is oftentimes what we see in these. They focus on the fact that the streets are filled with mud almost knee-deep because it had rained so bad. Despite this fact, the crowd that assembled was exceedingly large, and thousands proceeded to the Capitol to witness the inauguration ceremonies. The public and principal private buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue were gaily decorated with flags, and every window was thronged with faces to catch a glimpse of the president-elect in the presence of thousands who witnessed the interesting ceremony. Everything passed off in the most quiet and orderly manner, and although thousands participated in the ceremonies, not an accident occurred to mar the pleasures of the day. So the day is good. Don't really talk about the president's speech itself, though. Philadelphia Inquirer, under the celebratory headline, Abraham Lincoln, all caps with an exclamation point at the end, reprinted the entirety of the speech. And Lincoln has been honored because during 4 years of peculiar trial, he has done his utmost to subdue the enemies of the Republic, now that their mad theories have taken the shape of action. So we see a sort of certain militancy in a couple of these, using the language of, Lincoln, is owning the traitors, to kind of mix modern and period parlance there.
Just the fact that you're using the word traitor, a conversation for a different day, but like in today's conversation about this subject, where people that use that word are always usually retorted to with like, those are modern words we're putting on these people. And it's like baffling how easy it is to find that that's not the case. The contemporary descriptions use words like traitors.
And they mean it literally too. Like, not just, we don't like these guys, they're traitors. Like, they meant it as, when this war is over, these could be people who meet the legal definition of the word traitors who have committed treason. That's how they're seeing it in that moment.
Right.
And Lincoln never uses that term, so far as I know. But we know, based on his plans for Reconstruction that I alluded to at the beginning of our time, that he's thinking along these lines.
He's definitely in the mentality.
And so we have that in the background while he's saying malice toward none, charity for all. He means that mostly,
like, unless it's you.
Unless it's you, Mr. Colonel or higher. Unless it's you, Mr. Senator.
Jeff Davis, we're coming for you until other things happen.
Davis, Lee, Alexander Stevens. If you're
definitely Stevens,
there are so many of these figures.
You can't give the cornerstone speech and not get not get slapped. You know what I'm saying? Like you get
Yep.
bitch slapped. No.
But that, I could go on and on. But if anybody is interested, I have several examples of that.
So how long does it take for the speech to move into that sort of magical place that we know it to be? Like, do people recognize in the moment that, hey, that was something bigger than just the political? You said, like, he starts with a very powerful defense of his policy and like, this is what this is. But like, when does that sort of the mythology, the mythos of it all start to be like, whoa, that was bigger than that?
About 6 weeks later.
Okay.
Any guesses as to why?
Because he's already dead.
Because he's dead.
Yeah.
And this becomes sort of, this was his own eulogy, many people would say. Is I don't know if I have any quotes that specifically say that, but that's the sentiment is, he's talking about the mourners of the nation, the widows and orphans, and now suddenly he has those very things as well. He leaves behind a wife and children, and it's almost immediately, and that's the same thing with the Gettysburg Address. It had started to gain some traction, in the year and a half,
but it's
after he dies, because all these people are writing these eulogies, and they're needing look no further than both of the inaugural addresses, the Gettysburg Address, and these acts that he had performed, but also the words that he
The
himself had
film
spoken.
kind of also reinforces that he eulogized himself, because that's how they end the movie. I mean, they literally
It fades.
the way they do all that is very eulogistic. I don't know if that's a word, but it is literally. It feels like a eulogy.
Yes.
So then what is? So we've already kind of covered that Lincoln is living in this sort of gray area of complexity with his malice towards none, charity for all mentality. It's not as directly how you would think it is. Do the people carry on that for long? Because obviously we know how it plays out. Basically, everybody gets off scot-free unless you're Heinrich Wirtz. Does anybody attempt to carry on that complexity? Like, hey, yes, this was said. This is definitely going to be the case for rank and files, blah, blah, blah. But like, there has to be some nuance going back to that. Yeah. Does anybody do that?
Yes.
Okay.
So, obviously Jefferson Davis is imprisoned.
Yeah.
There is an indictment of Robert E. Lee. There's a great book called The Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee by John Reeves that really dives into this. But Lee's indictment is literally lost. Like, it is, and William Seward plays a role in this story. So somebody gives the original, this is, memory serves, it's been a few years since I read this. This was a COVID read for me. Somebody gives the actual indictment to William Seward, and he's showing it to someone as as like, hey, look at this, show and tell kind of thing. And somehow in that process, it gets literally lost and is not rediscovered until like the 1970s. And that's when Gerald Ford formally pardons Robert E. Lee. But there was a treason indictment against Robert E. Lee. But the big thing that they face, it's Judge John Underwood, I think is his name, is that by the letter of the law, you have to have the trial for the treason in the place where the quote-unquote treason was committed, which would be in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, is where the headquarters of the Confederacy, the capital of the Confederacy. And good luck finding 12 jurors who will indict Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia. And so that's sort of bound for failure from the beginning. And that's sort of the snowball that continues to grow as to why in that early phase of Reconstruction, when even Andrew Johnson, we often forget this because of what ends up happening, but even Andrew Johnson, for the first few months at least, is singing generally the same tune as Lincoln on many fronts. For instance, this is a tangential example, but he is supposed to go to Gettysburg July 4th, 1865. Oliver Otis Howard, the chairman of the Freedmen's Bureau, is chosen to deliver the keynote address at the cornerstone of the Soldiers' National Monument at its dedication. And it's a rather emancipationist address. Johnson can't make it. He's sick, but he does write a speech that someone delivers on his behalf. I think it's a pastor who delivers on his behalf, and he's talking all about many of the same themes at the end of the second inaugural there of not only binding up the nation's wounds and moving forward, but keeping freed people in mind and ensuring justice to them. And the military occupation of the South has a lot to do with ensuring that those things would take place. But then, of course, everything starts to break down between Johnson and Congress over how exactly this would be prosecuted the process of Reconstruction itself, and and Johnson's, really conservative white supremacist, frankly, leanings, of course, start to rear their head. So at first, I think Reconstruction looks very similar to what Lincoln would have wanted based on his Reconstruction. Now I'm starting to forget things the further we go. The proclamation on amnesty and Reconstruction, but also his very last speech on April 11th, 3 days before he's killed. John Wilkes Booth supposedly in the audience and says that's the last speech this man will ever make, because Lincoln proposes specifically the policy of some suffrage rights, at least for black men who served in the United States military. And that's the first time that any president, looks limited today from a modern perspective, but it's radical for its moment that a sitting president is suggesting black voting rights on a federal scale for anyone. And but that speech is all about Reconstruction. That's another great book. It's a fairly small one too. Lewis Mazur's Lincoln's Last Speech, which is all about this plan for Reconstruction. But I forget what your initial question was, but all of that to say that just
talking about people carrying on the complexity, because obviously we know. Just to kind of get back to it, I know that nothing happens, right? Heinrich Wirtz is literally the only person who is ever held accountable. I mean, you could argue in other ways, but in the reality, the legal sense, Heinrich Wirtz is hanged for war crimes and nobody else.
He's a representative example of
a lot of
all of the Confederate leaders. Yeah,
correct.
Exactly. And then you see in the aftermath of the 1876 election, of course, the end of Reconstruction and
the dismantling of it.
Absolutely. And that all happens, and former Confederates are back in office, and oftentimes, even today we'll see people criticize, that Lincoln was going to let him up easy. We would have seen that happen even earlier. And I always think no, there's nuance there.
That's the nuance.
And it's same thing as Grant. Grant gets criticized for being too lenient on Lee's army at Appomattox, but we often forget that there's a difference between what Grant is able to do as a military general versus what the people who are in civil power have the ability to do. Grant's not there to prosecute any form of Reconstruction. He's not there to determine what's going to happen to Lee and his soldiers. Grant does basically the only thing that he has the ability to do, which is, what do you do with these men literally in this moment? Are you going to try to arrest all of them, or do you tell them to go home? And when Sherman accepts Johnston's surrender, he basically gets criticized for trying to do too much, that he oversteps his authority in that moment. And so I think that there's a certain level of aspiration here as well in the inaugural address, of course, but even in Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, which is basically do what you can legally to stop the people who are at the upper echelon of this command and this leadership, but for the people who fought under them, let them return to their fields, let them return to their businesses, let them go on with their lives, because yes, the war's purpose changed, but a current undercurrent throughout it all is that this was the Union war effort to recreate the United States, right, and make an example out of those who were at the head of this movement. But of course, that never comes. And to me, even more than what would have happened if Lincoln had lived, I think the great question is, what if even one of those people, what if either Lee or Davis, let alone them both or others, what if one of them is tried and executed or serves life in prison,
held responsible officially in some way?
I think that that's maybe the great what if of all of American history.
So before we sort of get to the dangerous part of this as we wind down, I want to ask you, when William Seward has a hand in losing Lee's indictment, thinking about how Edwin Stanton kind of prosecutes the manhunt for Booth, the way that Mary Surratt and the other conspirators are all kind of handled through their military tribunals and things like that. Eventually it becomes very obvious that it's these people are going to become symbolic of other things, and we're doing this to kind of wrap things in bows so that we can all move on. Is the accidental losing of this indictment one of those, are you out of your mind if we do this? We're literally just going to rub salt. We're going to rub this wound. The war is over, these men did. Do you want to do this? Like, is there any of that involved potentially?
Probably.
Or suggest maybe that might be the case?
Yeah, from what I remember from reading Reeves's book, which I should go back and reread. I referenced the book enough, that suggest the book enough that I should refresh myself. But I think there's a little bit of that to that story. I really do think, though, that the biggest piece of it, from what I recall, is that Underwood, the judge, the federal judge, he wants this to happen. He is absolutely all about, let's get this indictment through, but he genuinely doesn't know how it could possibly be taken to full fruition. And that's the difference between, solely wanting there to be some sort of vindication versus going through the constitutional process to ensure that there is vindication. Right. And the constitutional process just inadvertently, I would say, made it so excessively difficult to actually prosecute anybody who was responsible for such crimes as it was perceived. And so I think that it just becomes ultimately how possible is this? How pragmatic a solution is this? And by the time that process really plays out and you assess that enough, then I think enough people, even those who are well-meaning, probably get to the point where they do realize, all right, guys, I don't know if there's anything we can do about this. This would be rubbing salt on the wound. Right. Yeah. And, I think because everything rhymes. I don't have to go into detail on this, but like using a recent example from a few Januaries ago.
Yeah.
If something doesn't immediately happen in the moment to ensure that the people who were responsible for it face the music,
it never happens.
It never happens. People forget about it. And like I said, even well-meaning people, even people who at the beginning of that were all for something to happen and justice, eventually it's just out of public consciousness. And even in the slow-moving news of the 19th century compared to now, that still happened.
So, all right, so let's at your comfort dip our toes into some dangerous water. This is the dangerous question. How do we apply the lessons that we've been able to learn from 160 years more of malice towards none, charity for all, this massive division of ourself, healing, binding the wounds of a nation? How do we apply those lessons to the moment we live in now, where I think, without being a modern commentary and honestly touching on the dangerous touchiness of the current moment, but like, we are very divided. And thankfully we are not at physical war with each other in the same way, but like, how do we move on from our current divisions? How do we apply the complexities of these thoughts of, on face value, charity for all, malice towards none, but how do we also navigate the honesty of the complexity of the spirit of that for Lincoln? And how do we apply it? Just kind of, how do we apply what we know from our studies to educating people on the now and moving forward? Again, it's dangerous. I know it's touchy if it's not something, but it's just, what do we do with all the things we learn? How do we apply them in our educations?
Yeah, I think that, the line, I've kind of paraphrased it a few times. I'll read it exactly here. It's just a short one sentence, but this has become something of a personal creed and just how I see the world and its issues. This is Lincoln's final public address. So new and unprecedented is the whole case that no exclusive and inflexible plan can safely be prescribed, but important principles may and must be inflexible. Now, much like Lincoln and the definition of the word liberty, we all interpret what we feel are inflexible principles differently. We all interpret what we feel is liberty differently. And once we get into our corners and we say, yeah, I'm willing, I'm talking now in the broad stroke of history, not right now. I'll talk about right now in a moment. But in the broad stroke, traditionally, we have been able to get into our corners and say, I'm not going to commit myself to any singular plan. I'm willing to work with you. Let's talk about this, but these are the lines I'm not willing to cross. These are the principles I'm not willing to lose. We've now entered a phase in recent memory, and it's cyclical because it happened in the 1860s as well, where we're not even willing to budge on the plan. We come into it with a plan and with the principles, and we say we can't budge on either of these, and both sides just stay in their corners as a result of that. But in a normal time of politics, and it's all relative, of course,
right?
we can usually find some amount of things that we're willing to say, well, you have a principle that I disagree with. I'm willing to budge even on this principle. But then there are moments, and I think our present time is one of those moments, where there are certain principles that are moved well beyond a Democratic principle or a Republican principle. Big R and big D there, the parties.
Yep.
It's not just a liberal principle or a conservative principle. It's a pro-democracy, pro-republic principle versus an anti-democracy, anti-republican principle. Right. And this is the first time we've had to deal with this on this scale since at least the time of Lincoln. And how did Lincoln overcome that? He realized, in a theme that we've heard throughout tonight, the necessity of change, that you shouldn't give in to the things that you morally are opposed to, but there are certain times when you kind of have to rewrite the entire playbook and reanalyze the entire system. And it's very telling that we have now gone, I forget the exact number of years, but I believe we've now gone longer than any period in American history between constitutional amendments. And there was a long swath of 200 years of history where it was just kind of expected that when a certain big issue came into being, that you had the means by which you could change the Constitution. It was intentionally a very difficult, long, drawn-out process to be able to do that, but you were able to sway enough Congress people and enough states to actually make that sort of change. And we've gone so long without being willing to do that. You know, even the pieces that are in place for us to change them on the broadest scale, we haven't used those methods in a very, very long time. All that, kind of rambling, but all of that to say that just because, how do I want to phrase that? Just because people want things to return to some semblance of normalcy doesn't mean that they want them to return to the way that they were before a couple of years ago.
Right.
Because we got into the situation that we're in because everything wasn't working for everyone.
Right.
And it's at moments like that that something revolutionary needs to happen. And I don't mean it has to be
like a revolution. Right.
But the 1960s are a prime example of this, where enough people protest in favor of something, enough people speak loudly enough people rally physically with their voices, with their words, and you can affect great revolutionary change. And I think we're seeing some aspects of that.
Right.
And we've seen that on both sides, to be fair. Like, there was a revolution electorally that swung one direction.
Right.
And a rather revolutionary backlash rhetorically against it.
Right.
You can pick up what I'm putting down.
Yeah, 100%.
And yeah, I feel like I've rambled, but that's
sort
of
but here's why I feel like
why
I feel like this is okay to talk about, because what we're not doing is saying like this is your Codie Eash personal opinion. It's like, look, we study history. We study honestly a lot of military history, but you can't discuss military history without the politics that go into it. And so what happens? They create ripples play out. Lately I've been thinking about this huge concept about sunlight and shadow, and how basically only one generation gets to live in the sunlight facing the future, and everybody else gets to live and grow up in the shadows. And it's in the struggle of life is the generation that has to pass that baton to the next stand and face the sunlight. But what that does is you then make everybody, they have all these actions while they're facing the sunlight for the future, which creates these shadows. We grow up in the shadows, but it's like it all ties to that. Mm-hmm. So the discussion of, like, we do this professionally, we do this even casually. Like, I think the funniest thing about people like us is like, oh, we're off the clock. Let's just continue doing the thing we were getting paid for doing all damn day. Like, I'm going to read and research and write. But I think it's okay to talk about it because we're being objective. I hope we're being objective. Like, I'm not sitting like me. It's my show. It's 7 years. I'm sure you've heard a lot. You could probably read very clearly through the lines, but in an attempt to be objective, I want to have this conversation legitimately because we are in a moment of great division. And I think we are going to have to figure out what happens when this moment passes. How do we look at ourselves? Not just our oppositions, but how do we look at ourselves? And how do we look at the greater, quote, us, that is the United States, and the same way Lincoln was doing these things in 1865, and like, what are the lessons? Because again, what is the point of what we do if we're not passing on the lessons?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not that we're casual history nerds. We are professionals. Our job is teaching, fundamentally.
Yep.
So I wanted to have this conversation because I want to kind of continue having it. And I want to give a shout out to a guest who's become a very good friend of mine from last season, a guy named Ken Gavin, who did our Valley Forge episodes. But we did a lot of talking about our obligations as interpreters, things like that. But I realized it's like, man, I have been stuck on the second inaugural because I think it is relevant. Like a lot of our colonial conversations, like this recent political world, we've done a lot of focusing on our revolutionary foundings. But I think Lincoln's second inaugural fits right into that conversation because of what the moment is. It's this moment of division and healing and prospects of the future with acknowledgments of the past and how it's all complex and woven together. And I probably said complex like 1,000 times in this episode tonight. Jesus Christ. You know, I thought it would be important to talk about how do we apply the lessons Lincoln has learned and is vocalizing. How do we apply those to our moment of great division? Because like you said, like, I think objectively speaking, thank goodness we're not shooting at each other in the same context, but we are probably as divided, if not more divided, than we were in the 1860s. So how do we look at this moment and apply it to our life today so we can find our path forward out of this stuff? So I think that's part of it is I wanted to have that conversation with you because of your insights into Lincoln, his mind. I look forward to getting more into sort of how he thinks about things, but I really do appreciate you not just having the delicate part, but just the whole conversation, because
Absolutely.
I think it's going to help. And that's something I want to do with the show moving forward, is just have more, not like we haven't had meaningful conversations, but maybe ones that apply more to the life we're living today. Not just casual studies of things we're interested in, but like, what is the point of doing all this if we're not actually sending it to meaningful places?
Yeah,
So
there is objective interpretation of the past, but then David Blight has this great line where he says, you know, none of us is a blank slate. We're like, historians are people, and we have our feelings on things and how the past can come forward to the present. And so, yeah, there are the things that we should be objective about, which is, you know, how historical figures dealt with one another and what they wrote, and present that as factually as possible. But that's a part of interpretation is what do we do with this? And when you just said Valley Forge there, I didn't mean to stare at my phone, but I was trying to pull up a thing here that ties together perfectly sort of three through lines that we've had throughout the entirety of this.
Cool.
This is Martin Luther King speaking September 12th, 1962. He's speaking at the centennial commemoration. It was the New York State Centennial Commission, something like that. And he's speaking on the occasion of 10 days before the 100th anniversary of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So it's all about Lincoln. It's all about the Civil War. And he ties in the Revolution and its legacies here. And it ties right into today. We are at one of history's awesome crossroads. I know that dark days still lie ahead. Gigantic mountains of opposition will still stand before us. We will encounter new setbacks, and some will still have to suffer persecution. But Valley Forge was followed by Yorktown.
I love it.
It's that
I love it.
broad stroke of history. And it's a bit of a play on the arc of the moral universe, bends toward justice, which comes out of the Civil War, and then is, of course, quoted by King as well. But you know, I've used that line since I first encountered it earlier this year as something of I kind of keep it in the back of my mind.
It's kind of like a hope, like keep hope.
Yeah,
keep
hope.
going, keep
Yeah.
going.
Keep going, because the people who started this whole thing, they kept going too. And in so many ways, I usually use this when I talk about the Civil War, but I've come to realize just how much it applies to any generation that had some sort of hope of progress. Is, you know, Lincoln talked about the unfinished work at Gettysburg and used lines along those lines on several occasions. And so many of the discussions that we're still having, the debates that we're still having, are because of these historical actors in eras when there was some unfinished conversation. And even well-meaning people attempted to finish that conversation, and they just never got there. And I really hope that, you know, we're in a moment where we don't leave a whole lot of this unfinished, that we can actually come to some consensus, some conclusion, because it's a lot of the skeletons in the closet of our history have caught up to us.
It's 2025 and it's a reckoning of 76.
Yes.
It's a reckoning of
65.
65 and all these things still. So, Codie, I want to thank you, man. I do really appreciate you coming to the show, sharing your wisdom with our listeners again. I'm excited tremendously to continue this conversation going forward. You have a very open invitation to the show. Basically, you could just say, hey, I want to come on and talk about anything you want. So what I want to do is, I got an idea that I'm not going to share with you, our listeners, right now. When I hit end record, I'm sharing an idea with this guy that hopefully, if you like it, you get to see something really cool. Maybe we get you out in the field. But I want to come back to meaningful conversations, because Lincoln's humanity, all of us could have conversations about humanity that I think would be great to look inward, but Lincoln might be a good sounding board for our own humanity. So I look forward to doing that. Make sure you get up to see Codie at the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Codie, how often can they find you?
They can find me there. I'm usually there Monday to Friday, not always in the museum itself. Not always on the front lines anymore.
You got a commission. That's right. You're an officer now.
Exactly, yeah. Sometimes I'm like, I kind of want to be back on the front line. And
then somebody says, how'd they fire around the monuments? And you're like, nope, glad I'm a director now.
So, the best way to figure out when you can see me to do a program, go to seminaryridgemuseum.org/events. Catch me on Fridays on the Ridge program, walking tour, battle anniversary program in the summer. Take a look, see if you can come into a Civil War roundtable or doing a virtual program or something. Maybe you'll catch me, but not as often at the museum desk itself. But there's a good chance you'll see me. I'm around.
He's around. Yeah. That's right. You can catch the History Things podcast on social media: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, by searching for the History Things podcast. Share the show with a history lover in your life. 5-star ratings and reviews are super appreciated. For those of you who have done those and really helped this show grow into 7 years now, we can never thank you enough. Make sure you keep that hard work going. And honestly, just as a big Firefly fan, it spreads the signal, and so just keep spreading it. So we'll have Codie Eash back. We have more on deck for you this year. Season 7 is going to be a wild one, as they always are here, so we look forward to that. So for Codie Eash, I'm Pat McGuire, and for Parker Russell, who has been here in spirit. We did mention Hannibal Hamlin. Maine did get talked about at some point in this episode. It did. For all of us here, it is the History Things podcast saying we will catch you all later. Slán Awalia.